The Shade of Yuzu, a Naruto story. It had been almost 16 years since the end of the Third Shinobi War that had ravaged the elemental nations for almost a decade. The casualties on all sides were tremendous, and the war seemed never-ending to those that were either involved or caught up in it. Several minor hidden villages of ninjas were wiped out in their entirety, including the secretive and feared village of Whirlpool, which was based in a small island chain off the coast of the Land of Fire. The village, while small, had been very well known for its sealing techniques and powerful ninja. As such, when they sided with the village of Konoha in the Great War, the great villages of Iwa and Kyumo, two of the five most powerful villages in the elemental nations, allied together to destroy the village, with a force of such magnitude that had never been seen before, including the most powerful of each village's ninjas, known as the Hidden Shadows or Kages. They mustered almost half of their combined fleets and set sail, whilst their spies amongst Konoha forces made them believe that they would be attacking on the northern front of the Land of Fire to draw away any possible support that could be sent to aid Yuzu. Against such a force, even the powerful defensive sealing techniques that the Whirlpool village had set up as a defensive measures to stop any ship from landing upon their shores were overcome using powerful earth ninja techniques to build an artificial harbor over the top of the deep reefs that Yuzu had placed their seals upon to create their defenses. The siege lasted a week, and the losses to the attacking forces were such that when they finally won the battle, and every member of the village had died in battle, even the children were killed or snuck out of the village with retainers and disappeared into the far reaches of the world, the attackers could only fill a tenth of the boats they arrived with. A year later, the fourth Hokage, known as the Yellow Flash for his incredible speed technique, effectively ended the war by felling over 400 enemy ninja in a single battle using his signature technique. The opposing villages quickly sued for peace, and the war ended, with Konoha the lauded winners, and the sacrifices of the Whirlpool forgotten by all but a few souls that had managed to evade the destruction. This story tells the tale of one of those survivors, in his quest to restore the glory and heritage of his home village to its former glory once more. Nabinaga Kage, known more these days by his bingo book name, the shadow of Yuzu, walked surely and slowly through the small village that was on the outskirts of Hai no Kuni. He had not been to the country in almost half a decade, and with good reason. He was still considered a missing ninja of the Whirlpool village despite its lack of existence. And as one of the only survivors of the once famed ninja village of Yuzu, or the Whirlpool Hidden Village as it was commonly known, his knowledge of the Yuzu jutsu and sealing techniques were attractive prizes to the minor villages. And even the Great Five wouldn't turn down the opportunity if he was captured by their ninja and pumped for information. Shrugging off these rather morbid thoughts, he walked up to the door of the village hall, which served as both the residence and workplace of the village mayor and his administrative aides. The hall also contained the wanted posters and arrest warrants, which was how he got by these days. Petty criminals and bandits didn't stand a chance, and it was decent pay. Entering inside, he found a few Konoha shinobi there already, dressed up for a mission, and the leader of the four was asking the village mayor for information about something. They were all chunin and relatively young, so he had no reason to worry about being spotted. The descriptions of him in the bingo book were vague and hazy, with only a photo of him from his genin days, and none of them were old enough to have fought with him 20 years ago. As such, he walked past them and to the board, which he perused half-heartedly. There didn't seem to be any new bounties, and the ones that were up he knew were obsolete. He had already completed most of them and brought the bounties to other villages. His keen hearing caught the words of one of the leaving chunin, and it caused him to freeze in place as a word that he had thought would never be mentioned in idle conversation again. We better find these bandits quickly. The last thing I want to miss is the Uzumaki hunt, best part of the October 10th festival. Watching the demon Eska. He was cut off by the impact of a fist to his solar plexus, sending him to the floor in a daze. Kage was already striking the next one, a debilitating blow to the knee, shattering the bone easily with a chakra-infused strike. The two remaining chunin were reacting now, caught off guard by the attack on their home turf, as it were, by an unknown shinobi. the shorter of which was reaching into his kunai pouch when Kage Roundhouse kicked him with enough force to send him through the open door to the hall and skidding down the street, the man flailing helplessly as he did so. The last managed to draw the blade at his waist and struck out at Kage, cutting a large gash into his side, and smirked superiorly for a moment, only for it to turn to shock as Kage dissolved into what could only be described as shadows, before a chop to the back of the neck knocked him out almost casually by the real Kage, who had appeared from his own shadow. The one whose knee had been injured was grasping for a kunai or other weapon in his pouch when suddenly Kage was there, in front of him, a terrifying mask of shadows clawing and reaching for him, miniature faces of horror and terror flitting across it, as if there were souls of people trapped inside, trying to get out. "Where is the Uzumaki?" The voice was dark and promised an eternity of pain and suffering, though this did not stop the Chunin trying to be brave. Screw you, demon. You are just like the brat. Konoha will deal with both." He cut off with a scream as Kage wrenched his shattered knee. "Tell me, or your friends will die screaming in front of you." As if to prove a point, one of the other Chunin moaned in obvious pain, and the man decided that it would be best to talk. "The Uzumaki brat is in Konoha. There, I told you he wanted to know. Now leave us be." Kage growled again, tempted to hurt the men further, just for what had been discussed by them before his interference. The phrasing of the activity, Uzumaki hunt, sounded barbaric at best, and what was with the repeated references to demons? But regardless of what the connotations of such talk could mean, the fact that one of the Uzumaki house could be alive was not something he could ignore, and if this hunt was on the 10th of the month, he had less than 2 days to reach Konoha, which whilst also dodging patrols and infiltrating past the vaunted Konoha security systems would be no mean feat with that in mind. He performed the Shushin Jutsu without hand seals, such was his experience with the Jutsu, and disappeared into roiling. Shadows that leapt from the floor to claim him, leaving a downed Konoha team and a terrified mayor who was hiding behind his desk, in case the mystery shinobi decided that he wanted to come after him next. Time skip 2 days. Location, Konoha. Naruto ran as fast as he could, something that he was used to doing nowadays. Knowing what day it was, he had done his best to be back inside the orphanage in time, but the matron had closed and locked the gates as he ran up, claiming that a night outside would make him more punctual. The blatant truth of it was that she didn't like him, like most of Konoha's citizens, though for what reason he wasn't sure, and none of them would tell him anything other than he had killed their families and was a terrible demon, which made no sense, as he knew he hadn't killed anyone. Though this knowledge was the only constant he could remember in the 11 years of surviving he had managed so far. Not that it mattered, he thought wryly as he dodged another drunken lunge from a villager, ducking into a side street that he knew became very narrow about halfway down its length so that only one person could pass through at a time comfortably. The mob following him was closing, though he knew he had managed to escape for now as he dived through the narrow point, ending it with a roll that brought him back to his feet and running, as the point in question became clogged with people all trying to barge through at once to get at him. Using the precious time he had been given, he headed for the slums. The people there were a lot nicer to him. Despite their usually less than honest occupations, none of them had raised a hand against him, and even hit him on occasion when the crowds became too much for him to escape from. Just as he thought he was about to make it, something slammed into him with the force of a cannonball, sending him flying into the street wall with a shout of pain as 2 of his ribs cracked. There standing over him was a man in a ninja uniform and wearing a Chunin flak jacket, snarl visible on his face as he raised a short blade over his head. The demon thinks he gets to escape, does he? Not today, you don't. Feel free to scream. It will make it that much more enjoy. Ugh. The man cut off as a blade similar to the one he was currently wielding embedded itself through his abdomen. Behind him was stood a figure that almost seemed cloaked in darkness itself. Bloody blade dissolving into the same type of shadows as he lowered his hand. The mob had used this time to navigate the passage and was drawing up down the street warily. Seeing the injured Chunin on the floor, their mutterings became more worried and urgent. The cloaked figure ignored them, instead dropping to his knees and raising his hand to Naruto's injuries, green light like the nice men at the hospital used to heal him, used emanating from his hand. The voice caught him off guard, and would have scared him if the man hadn't already saved him and was healing him of his broken bones. "Are you the Uzumaki they call Naruto?" Naruto nodded hesitantly and was shocked when the man then reached out with his free hand and gestured for him to take it. "I am Nobunaga Kage, and I am an ally of your clan from many years ago. Take my hand, and we shall leave here to somewhere safe." Naruto couldn't believe it. This man knew about his family? Without having to think a moment further, he reached up and grasped as much of the man's large hand as he could with his own small digits. Everything went black for a moment before he found himself with the man in his orphanage room. Bare, as it was something he could actually say was his own. The cloaked man was rummaging in his cloak for something as Naruto finished getting his bearings. Leaping to his feet, he performed his best bow to the man before expressing himself verbally. "Oh no, thank you for back there, Kage-san. I was in a lot of trouble before you got there. And were you saying you know something about my family? Was that true?" Kage drew out a small scroll of his cloak as he nodded. "It was Naruto, but first I must verify that you are in fact a Uzumaki by blood, not just an unluckily named orphan. I would not wish for you to get your hopes up needlessly." Naruto nodded in understanding. The number of times that people had given him good news on for it later to come to nothing, he was kind of used to it, though the fact the man was testing him before telling him anything false was new. "How are we going to test it, Kage-san? I mean, even Hokage Gigi claimed he didn't know who my parents were and that there wasn't a good way to find out. So what's your plan?" Kage paused at the word Hokage, but recovered fairly quickly. "This scroll is blood-sealed to the blood of the Uzumaki. As long as you are more than a quarter Uzumaki, it should open when you put some of your blood on it." Naruto beamed. This was a chance to find out if he did belong to a clan, a way to get back at all those idiots in the academy that claimed he was nothing but a clan less waste of space. He reached up and swiped a small amount of blood from his still bleeding lip and placed it against the scroll's red seal. Nothing happened for a moment, and Naruto was about to sigh in disappointment when the seal glowed blue and a complicated inscription became visible round the scroll, and then the seal came unstuck. Naruto was overjoyed and began jumping up and down with excitement. He was a true Uzumaki, whatever that meant. He stopped when he heard Kage chuckling to himself, the noise turning into full-blown laughter as the man shook his head. "I've spent almost 2 decades searching far and wide through the dungeons of the elemental nations for even a rumor of a survivor of the Uzumaki clan. And yet, all this time, there was one so close to home, in the land of our allies. Cammy does like to play her little games with me." Shaking his head once more, he quieted and then became serious. "But now, young heir, you must make a decision. Do you wish to learn about your clan and our way of the ninja?" The man could not have said anything else other than perhaps offering ramen to get Naruto interested. "Of course I do. Are you going to teach me, Kage-sensei?" The man nodded, but spoke once more. "That I will, but to do so, I must take you to your clan's home, which is away from Konoha. This means you would have to leave with me for a year or 2, so that you can learn all you can before your return here to become a ninja. I assume you wish to live up to your clan's legacy." Naruto nodded. If his clan were ninjas, then it would only be right to learn about them. "But what about Hokage Gigi? I am not sure he will want me to just leave the village without him knowing." Something of a sadistic smile came over Kage's face as he stood. "Don't worry about that, Naruto. I know your Gigi from a long time ago, so I will leave him a clone that will have a chat with him about it. I'm sure we'll all be okay, though, so just get your stuff together." Naruto tilted his head in confusion, then nodded his head. If Kage knew Gigi and said it would be fine, everything was okay in his books. Without further ado, he rushed around the room, grabbing his few belongings from his created hiding places. He was going to learn and become an awesome ninja. This was great. Time skip, 30 minutes. Hiruzen Tsurutobi rushed into the orphanage, hoping the report that he had received from a very out-of-breath hospital attendant was incorrect. According to the reports, an unknown man had appeared during the festival, injured a Chunin, and kidnapped Naruto before disappearing somewhere unknown in a flash of darkness. This coincided with the report of a Konoha team being taken out in a village to Konoha's southwest, where a man of similar description had questioned them about the boy before disappearing in the same manner only 2 days beforehand. The distance that he had traveled alone made that an impressive feat rushing into Naruto's room. He found a room bare, all of Naruto's little hiding places open for the world to see, emptied of their contents. He reached out with his senses, and upon finding the hidden chakra source, he moved instinctively, kunai at the man's throat before the man could even begin to react, killing intent rocketing to massive levels. The man in front of him seemed calm behind his bone white mask, however, and began talking as if they were sitting down over drinks instead of being threatened at knife point. The Uzumaki heir is gone already, and I mean him no harm to him in any way, Hiruzen, which is better than I can say for your village. Also, you might as well put the kunai away. I am but a shade that is here to discuss what is to happen with the heir and his heritage. Sarutobi glared at the man, even as he ascertained using his chakra sense that yes, it was a clone and that the real man was nowhere nearby. I don't trust the word of missing ninja Nobunaga, especially one who was exiled from Yuzu on the order of the last Uzumaki head. For all, I know you will try and turn the boy against us, or worse, kill him in petty revenge. The mask frothed and turned black, an obvious sign of the man's dislike of Sarutobi's accusations. You know better than anyone alive that I would not raise a blade against the Uzumaki clan, not with my clan's own honor at stake. I hold no grudge against them, and I wish to see them grow strong once more. My exile is unimportant in comparison. The man stalked the room for a moment as Sarutobi watched, his anger curbed slightly with the reminder of the blood debt that the Kage clan owed to the Uzumaki for saving the clan during an ambush before the establishment of the ninja villages, when the clans traveled by themselves and were often targeted by rival clans in an attempt to eliminate them. The rival clans of the Kage had joined together and attacked at high noon, the worst time for the Kage techniques and bloodline, and with the added difficulty of protecting the non-combatants, the Kage clan members were in grave danger. Then from the trees came the warriors of the Uzumaki, their predominantly red hair streaming as they brought loud death upon the clan's attackers, forcing them to retreat in short order, leaving over half their number dead or captured. To the Kage clan's surprise, the Uzumaki did not torture or humiliate their captured foes, as many of the clans did back in that time, turning them into servants or even worse, sex objects for breeding, as some of the more barbaric clans were known to doing. Instead, the Uzumaki treated the injured of both sides in short order, and then sent out one of the captured members back to his clan with an offer of parley and negotiation for the captured ninja's return. Soon afterwards, the Ukiya and the Senju clans would settle together in Konoha, bringing people to believe that they began the era that would give rise to the great ninja villages. But it was in fact the Kage Uzumaki and the two clans they had fought that day that formed the village of Yuzu almost 2 months beforehand, with all three clans swearing allegiance to the Uzumaki, and the village named in their honor as they were the most numerous of the ninjas out of the clans, and the other clans saw the Uzumaki as the best to head the village, as they had no possible history with the other clans that may cause tensions in the village's future. But that aside, there was still the fact that Naruto was now in the hands of a non-Konoha ninja who did not know of the boy's burden, or in fact his lineage at all. Nevertheless, even if you won't harm him, there's the fact that you are one of the most wanted ninja in the elemental nations, with IWA Village wanting your head almost as much as they wish to have the fourth Hokages. The last thing Naruto needs is that level of hate directed at him at this age. Kage chuckled wryly and looked at the Hokage disbelievingly. You say that when the boy is chased through the village, locked out of the orphanage he calls home for no good reason, and is threatened with bodily harm. No, actually, that's not the correct phrase. It was actual torture by your own ninja. I think that being with me and having to deal with the occasional glory hunter will be a nice break for him. The man stopped pacing and chuckled. Not that it matters whether you approve or not really. We're already gone from the village, and you know what happens to Hunter Ninja who are sent after me, so I wouldn't bother. What I more want to know is when can I send Naruto back here so he can become a ninja? Sarutobi observed him in surprise. What do you mean? I thought you were going to teach him the way of the Yuzu. Kage shook his head and clarified himself. I will teach him just that, and as much of the Uzumaki knowledge as I was privy to whilst I am at it. But I refuse to let the Uzumaki simply die out. They must be reborn somewhere, and Konoha is as good a place as any to do that. Despite the feelings of the civilians here, it is better than Kyumo or IWA. So therefore he must be a Konoha ninja, not a Ronin or mercenary. Sarutobi relaxed. Kage would not be able to reveal any of the secrets that he did not yet wish Naruto to know about his heritage, or give him knowledge of his tenet, but at the same time would train him in the way that his mother would have wanted and return a much stronger ninja because of it. There are 2 more years before his age group enter their final year of academy, so you have until then to train him. I expect him to return by the start of June that year. I also want to report every 6 months, and you are to stay away from Kyumo and IWA. They are those that would most take advantage of you having a student to try and use against you. Sarutobi felt the years falling off him as he dictated the terms of this rather forced training trip. No longer was he the old man, forced to return to work after the tragic events on the night of Naruto's birth that led to the death of his successor. He felt like the commanding officer of Konoha's army, the rightfully feared Kami no Shinobi. Kage nodded. Sounds fair, and I'll be around after that. Your security is bad enough that they couldn't stop me anyways. See you in 2 years, old man. And with that, the clone was gone, obviously on its way to report to its master. One of his ANBU guards appeared from under his Jinjutsu hiding place. Shall we follow him, Hokage-sama? Sarutobi shook his head. There were other things to deal with. No bore. We shall not. Naruto will be safe with him. In the meantime, I want the orphanage staff rounded up. Evidently, someone has been lying to me about Naruto's well-being here. Also, that man in the hospital, have him to Ibiki the moment he is well enough. I think he has falsified his statement about what happened between him and Nobunaga. 2 of his ANBU left, and were less than a minute later replaced by 2 more members. It wouldn't do to leave him underguarded with a rogue ninja, possibly still in the village after all. With a sigh, he moved off at a more sedate pace this time. There was still paperwork to be done before he could return once more to his home. Hopefully he would be able to see his daughter before she went to bed this night, yet. Last time on the Shades of Yuzu. There are 2 more years before his age group enter their final year of academy, so you have until then to train him. I expect him to return by the start of June that year. I also want to report every 6 months, and you are to stay away from Kyumo and IWA. They are those that would most take advantage of you having a student to try and use against you. Sarutobi felt the years falling off him as he dictated the terms of this rather forced training trip. No longer was he the old man, forced to return to work after the tragic events on the night of Naruto's birth that led to the death of his successor. He felt like the commanding officer of Konoha's army, the rightfully feared Kami no Shinobi. Kage nodded. Sounds fair, and I'll be around after that. Your security is bad enough that they couldn't stop me anyways. See you in 2 years, old man. And with that, the clone was gone, obviously on its way to report to its master. One of his ANBU guards appeared from under his Jinjutsu hiding place. Shall we follow him, Hokage-sama? Sarutobi shook his head. There were other things to deal with. No bore. We shall not. Naruto will be safe with him. In the meantime, I want the orphanage staff rounded up. Evidently, someone has been lying to me about Naruto's well-being here. Also, that man in the hospital, have him to Ibiki the moment he is well enough. I think he has falsified his statement about what happened between him and Nobunaga. 2 of his ANBU left, and were less than a minute later replaced by 2 more members. It wouldn't do to leave him underguarded with a rogue ninja, possibly still in the village after all. With a sigh, he moved off at a more sedate pace this time. There was still paperwork to be done before he could return once more to his home. Hopefully he would be able to see his daughter before she went to bed this night yet. And now for the new chapter. Time skip, 2 years. Persona change, Kotetsu, Chunin of Konoha. Kotetsu stamped the forms of entry for what must have been the 1000th merchant caravan of the day. His partner Izumo having used his chakra senses to check for possible ninja infiltrators amongst the group, in addition to physically searching the wagons for contraband or illegal materials. It was not a hard job by any means, and they only occasionally got the odd genin-level missing ninja coming seeking asylum from their past, and dealing with them was left to the ANBU patrols that covered the walls. He liked to think that they were being useful, however, ensuring that the gates of Konoha were ever left unguarded or vulnerable. He was about to settle back into his chair when suddenly Izumo stiffened and his head shifted to the road. Such a reaction would not have caused anyone else to do more than raise an eyebrow. But Kotetsu had worked with Izumo for almost 10 years, and each knew the other's little reactions to the point that they didn't need to use anything more than a look to convey plans and conversations. Kotetsu was on his feet and by Izumo's side in the next second, hand on his kunai pouch even as he joked lightly. "What is it, Izumo? Bunch of geisha girls coming this way." Izumo's gaze did not shift even to acknowledge Kotetsu's humor question, and Kotetsu was about to ask again when Izumo finally spoke. "There's someone approaching, all right, but his chakra is off the scales, and it is so wild, unlike anything I have encountered." Those words made Kotetsu straighten up as well, as he then also began scanning the horizon at the same time as flaring his chakra. He knew it would be a little wasteful, but it was the quickest way to alert the nearest ANBU squad. If this man's chakra was as powerful as Izumo said, then they would need backup very quickly. After another minute, a shape appeared on the horizon, and subconsciously both Izumo and Kotetsu flinched in readiness. After another few seconds, Kotetsu relaxed as his keen eyesight picked out the figure's features. "Izumo, it's just a kid. Surely you have just read his chakra." He cut off as even he felt the chakra of the boy that had just appeared next to them in a move of stealth and speed that if Kotetsu hadn't felt it occur, he would not have believed it if someone had told it to him in a bar. Kotetsu turned defensively at the same time as Izumo, weapons being drawn even as they were presented with the once familiar grinning face of the resident container, dressed in simple brown clothes and a voluminous black cloak. The boy then spoke up as if he had just walked up to them as opposed to sneaking up to them in what had seemed a threatening manner. "Hi, Naruto Uzumaki requesting entrance to the village of Konoha. I think the Hokage is expecting me." "Wait a minute. Why are you guys pointing your weapons at me?" The newly revealed blonde raised his hands in a placating manner as Kotetsu and Izumo had kunai raised and ready to fight. "The Hokage is expecting you in 3 days' time, Uzumaki-san, which is why we had not yet alerted the gate guards to your possible arrival." The voice caused all three to look towards the gate, where they found a squad of 3 ANBU stood in a relaxed stance, headed by a cat-masked female ANBU that looked across at the boy in what was obviously a disapproving manner as he reached up and scratched the back of his head in a nervous reflex. "Ah, I knew I had forgotten something when I decided to be a bit quicker getting here. Gomenasai, Nico-san. So should I go away and come back in 2 days?" Kotetsu nearly lost his composure due to his shock at the Uzumaki's inane question, and he saw that he wasn't the only one, with Izumo a lot more obvious in his disbelief. Nico shook her head disbelievingly and responded with no small amount of humor in her voice. "No, you can enter now, Naruto Hokage-sama will be surprised but pleased, I imagine. The last thing I need is you hanging around unnerving the guard for the next 2 days. I was told that you would have someone else with you." Naruto shook his head. "Kage-sensei is off to chase after some other information he has picked up. He will be back soon, I am sure. Shall I meet you at the tower? I doubt Konoha has changed enough to make me lose my sense of direction." Nico shook her head once more, something that Kotetsu got the feeling that people would be doing a lot more due to the actions of the blonde boy in the future, especially with his seemingly great new powers. "I am afraid you will have to come with me to see him, Naruto. The other ANBU haven't been informed of your arrival, and your chakra will unnerve them. Not something you need on your first day back." Naruto shrugged, then grinned widely at her. "Okay, you better lead on then, Nico-chan. Wouldn't want for me to leave you behind." Nico merely chuckled and leapt off with Naruto following close behind her, The other two ENBU disappearing and Shushin's back to their patrol routine, leaving the two bewildered Chunin without even the slightest of explanations of what happened. Izumo spoke first, softly as if expecting he was being watched and listened on by unseen forces. Kotetsu, I think things are about to get a lot more hectic around here again, and I don't think any infiltrating ninja is going to have anything to do with it. Kotetsu could not help but agree with Izumo, even if he didn't voice it. The QB container had left as a simple orphan with no skills and hated by the populace, and now he had returned, not seeming to have changed in personality at least. But now with considerable skills that were beyond normal ninja to use effectively, any villager stupid enough to attack him would be the one in grave danger, not the other way around. Strangely, Kotetsu was not particularly upset at that idea. In fact, it would be a good way of dealing with several of the more idiotic members of the civilian populace that caused trouble for everyone, not only Naruto. The more he thought about it, the better it sounded, and he burst out into a happy whistle, ignoring the weird look that Izumo threw him. He would tell him later, and he would find it as funny as he did most likely. Yes, Naruto was back, and hell would probably break loose anytime now. Previously on the Shades of Yuzu, Izumo spoke first, softly as if expecting he was being watched and listened on by unseen forces. Kotetsu, I think things are about to get a lot more hectic around here again, and I don't think any infiltrating ninja is going to have anything to do with it. Kotetsu could not help but agree with Izumo, even if he didn't voice it. The QB container had left as a simple orphan with no skills and hated by the populace, and now he had returned, not seeming to have changed in personality at least. But now with considerable skills that were beyond normal ninja to use effectively, any villager stupid enough to attack him would be the one in grave danger, not the other way around. Strangely, Kotetsu was not particularly upset at that idea. In fact, it would be a good way of dealing with several of the more idiotic members of the civilian populace that caused trouble for everyone, not only Naruto. The more he thought about it, the better it sounded, and he burst out into a happy whistle, ignoring the weird look that Izumo threw him. He would tell him later, and he would find it as funny as he did most likely. Yes, Naruto was back, and hell would probably break loose anytime now. New chapter, begin. Time skip, 20 minutes. Persona change, Hiruzen Sarutobi, 3rd Hokage of Konoha. Sarutobi looked up from his work, slightly surprised as he felt the speed of the approaching chakra signatures, but smiled fondly as both Nico and Naruto appeared through the window. The pace that Nico was traveling at, and more importantly Naruto, was keeping up with was impressive indeed, certainly greater than any of his current genin could manage over such a distance without being out of breath. Though he supposed Naruto had always had an advantage in physical training aspects due to his tenet. So that would be expected now. He had received suitable one-to-one training. Looking closer with his experienced eyes, Sarutobi noted the steady stance that Naruto set himself in as he set himself straight. One of a warrior now, as opposed to that of the child that had left with Kage 2 years beforehand. Naruto brushed himself off once, then grinned up at Sarutobi in a way that would have made Sarutobi wish to respond even if he hadn't been doing so already. Long time no see, GG. I see the paperwork is as bad as it always is. Want to ditch it and grab some ramen? Sarutobi chuckled to himself, even as Nico struck out like a coiled snake, and Naruto reeled from a clip on the ear with a yelp. Though, Naruto had attempted to dodge the blow Sarutobi noted, so his reflexes and danger sense were developed to the same level as his speed, which was always handy, as it meant that a fighter would not react in a way his body couldn't keep up with, or move at a speed that made his reactions much less efficient due to his pace. Nico spoke angrily at the blonde in front of him, hands still out and ready despite the rest of her posture being strictly professional in front of her leader during such a bizarre meeting. Naruto-san, show respect to Hokage-sama. Just because you've been off gallivanting around with a clan member of yours does not mean that everyone is to be treated as family. Sarutobi raised his hand, silencing the rest of her lecture. He had to admit that he had never imagined Nico to act so motherly at Naruto's actions. The reason why she had become so agitated became obvious a moment later when Naruto spoke up, his face that of a kitten that had just been kicked. Ah, sorry Nico-chan, it's just that me and Hokage-sama go a long time back, so he's like family to me, and he hasn't told me off for it yet. I will try to be less familiar with those I don't know in future, though Nico-chan. Nico's face mask meant that her facial expression was unreadable, but Sarutobi could see in her body posture she was resisting the urge to crack and either hit or hug the boy. He wasn't sure which, and didn't really want to wait to find out which would be carried out. Speaking up before anyone else could interrupt, he stood at the same time, moving round the table. He is right, Nico. Naruto here is like a grandson of mine, though admittedly one that I cannot keep in the village no matter what I try. The crack at Naruto's foolishness was lessened when he beckoned the boy to come give him a hug. He was mildly upset that the boy was now at his shoulder when they met. The time for hugs with another of his close family would be over soon, it seemed. Naruto drew back, looking properly contrite this time, as opposed to the attempt to get off by being cute like he had pulled on Nico. Sorry, Gigi, but he knew my family and their history, even if he didn't know my parents themselves. And well, now I look back on it, I see that I should have waited to make sure he talked to you rather than leaving with a stranger, but it was still the best thing I could have done. I have learned so much with him. Sarutobi's eyes darted to Nico at this point, and knew that she had caught on that there was more about this trip than Sarutobi had let out to anyone who had not been present that night, even one of his top operatives who had proved her loyalty over and over again. I know you did. Reading your letters reassure me of that fact. I am not going, but where is Kage? I intended to offer him asylum here, in Konoha, so he could rest and continue to help you. Naruto shrugged dismissively, his hand unconsciously reaching for a small pendant on his cloak. Sorry, Gigi, Kage said he had heard of a red-haired girl in grass country with Uzumaki features that had been brought up as an orphan. So he wanted to go find out if she was an Uzumaki as well. So I would imagine he's going to be busy for the next couple of months at least. Sarutobi sighed at this. Kage had been a loose cannon even when he had been tied down to Yuzu. He imagined even if he did join the village when he arrived, he would be like his old student Jiraiya, who was out of the village for years at a time, looking after his information networks, and building a web of favors and agents to help Konoha should another war erupt. Then there is nothing that we can do in that regard at this moment in time apart from await his return. Now, Naruto, whilst you have been away, I have been doing some investigating into the orphanage, and I found that they were treating not just you, but several other children with the care that they were required to do so. So therefore, I have moved you out of the orphanage using some of the money that I have confiscated from them. Your new apartment building was being prepared for you, but because of your early return, it is not quite ready for you. As such, you will be a guest at my home for the next 2 nights. I know that my daughter Ria has missed your antics over the last 2 years. Naruto's smile beamed. Such was its intensity. Thanks, Gigi. That's brilliant news. It would be good to meet the rest of my unofficial family. Sarutobi chuckled, and then asked on a slightly more serious note. Where are your belongings? I imagine that Kage likes to travel light, but to leave you with only the clothes on your back wouldn't be like him. Naruto looked confused, and then shook his head in understanding. I imagine he didn't tell you then. Wouldn't put it past him. He forgets the most important of things at times. Kage has been teaching me what he knows of seals, and when we were in the ruins of Yuzu, he accessed several storage rooms that had been hidden well enough to survive the assault and the attention of scavengers. And these had more blood seal scrolls that we could access that taught both of us more about the subject than Kage could have hoped to teach me. So all my belongings, as well as those scrolls, are sealed in various places on my clothes that only I can access. Sarutobi nodded, secretly giddy at the thought that had occurred to him whilst Naruto was speaking. As much as he tried not to force Naruto into following the path of a ninja, a way of life that Sarutobi had always advocated had to be chosen by the individual, not forced onto it, as they were in some of the smaller villages. If they had a bloodline or ability that was useful to the village's power and prosperity, he could not help but be reassured that the Uzumaki seals, which had been so advanced that infiltrating the village without detection had been impossible to anyone other than the second. Suchikage, who had been renowned for his infiltration and assassination skills that were the best in history, would soon be defending Konoha if Naruto was anything like his clansmen when it came to skills with seals. Remembering that Nico was still present and that he would undoubtedly need debriefing after what she had heard in the office so far this morning, it was best to send Naruto away so he could get back to his paperwork before it managed to build up again without him noticing, as it always seemed to on such days. Right, Naruto? Well, I will let you go to refresh your knowledge of the village and its layout. I need to continue my work after all, lest it bury me after you leave. Naruto laughed at the now familiar joke between the two of them and nodded in understanding. Of course, Gigi, I will see you tonight. And with no waiting around, he headed out the main doors, greeting a very surprised secretary on the way. Once Sarutobi had had it confirmed by his bodyguards that Naruto was well away from the area, he turned to Nico, who was still stood at attention, waiting for an order. Stand easy, Yugao. I get the feeling we have a lot to discuss before I can get back to work. Previously on Shades of Yuzu, as much as he tried not to force Naruto into following the path of a ninja, a way of life that Sarutobi had always advocated had to be chosen by the individual, not forced onto it as they were in some of the smaller villages. If they had a bloodline or ability that was useful to the village's power and prosperity, he could not help but be reassured that the Uzumaki seals, which had been so advanced that infiltrating the village without detection had been impossible even to the second Tsuchikage, who had been renowned for his infiltration and assassination skills due to his unique abilities, would soon be defending Konoha if Naruto was anything like his clansmen when it came to skills with seals. Remembering that Nico was still present and that he would undoubtedly need debriefing after what she had heard in the office so far this morning, it was best to send Naruto away so he could get back to his paperwork before it managed to build up again without him noticing, as it always seemed to on such days. Right, Naruto? Well, I will let you go to refresh your knowledge of the village and its layout. I need to continue my work after all, lest it bury me after you leave. Naruto laughed at the now familiar joke between the two of them and nodded in understanding. Of course, Gigi, I will see you tonight. And with no waiting around, he headed out the main doors, greeting a very surprised secretary on the way. Once Sarutobi had had it confirmed by his bodyguards that Naruto was well away from the area, he turned to Nico, who was still stood at attention, waiting for an order. Stand easy, Yugao. I get the feeling we have a lot to discuss before I can get back to work. The Shades of Yuzu, Chapter 4, Back to Class and Hating Every Minute of It. It had not taken long for Naruto to reacquaint himself with the village. Other than a change in patrol times and several of the main street shops either expanding or closing down and changing into something else, it was much the same as when he left. If he had been the same boy he was when he had left with Kage, then he would have probably announced his return to the village with some ostentatious prank. However, amongst the other things that Kage had taught him about life in general, as well as being a ninja, he had gained a respect for the idea of anonymity and apathy as opposed to angering the villagers straight off the bat. As such, he had instead found out from the Hokage which class he would be in when the academy started again after the summer break. He had had limited interaction with the class in question, apart from a somewhat childish crush he had had on one of the girls in the class, a civilian girl called Sakura Haruno that he had met in the pre-academy tutelage, that had quickly been mostly forgotten under Kage's tutelage and the vast traveling the pair had done. As such, she had been the first person he had tracked down. Surprisingly, she had been by herself, reading in one of the many parks that covered the village's interior. She seemed a lot calmer than he remembered her being, but definitely not the jaw-dropping beauty that his mind had conjured when he had remembered her initially. She was pretty, there was no denying that, but her rather violent tendencies at times were rather off-putting, and that was putting it lightly. Leaving her then, he had followed several other members of his future class, and was on the whole disappointed with all of them. Kage had always shown that Naruto was nowhere near as powerful as he thought he was, claiming that in modesty came the understanding of strength. Yet at the same time, there were these kids who lorded their academy training over their non-ninja friends, though most of the males would struggle to pass the academic parts of the test with how they were at the moment, and most of the girls were too busy chasing after the last Yukiya, who was interestingly in his class, as well along with several other of the great clan heirs of Konoha. The great clans, as they were termed by those outside of Konoha's walls, consisted of the 10 most influential clans in Konoha. These were the Akimichi clan, the Yamanaka clan, the Nara clan, the Abruame clan, the Inzuku clan, the Hyuga clan, the Senju clan, the Kurama clan, the Hitaki clan, and the Ukiya clan, all with their own clan ninja techniques or bloodlines that made their ninja unique and more powerful than those outside the clans. Over the last 40 years, however, 4 of these clans had fallen into decline, the Ukiya the most recent of those in a bloody massacre that occurred in the first year that Naruto had been out of the country. The massacre was done by the clan heir of all things, and whilst information on what had occurred that night was sketchy at best, it was known that the younger brother of the clan heir was the only survivor, and that his brother had used his dojutsu, or a linked bloodline, which was called the Sharingan, to induce some kind of mental attack on the boy, which left him in hospital for almost 2 months, delaying his start at the academy that had occurred that year. The Senju clan and the Hitaki clan were reduced to their last members, and both clans had resisted the efforts of the council to force them to begin repopulating their numbers. The Kurama clan were in troubled waters in a different way. Their bloodline was becoming more erratic, to the point that their most gifted member had been withdrawn from the academy due to her losing control of her bloodline. The fact that every one of the other great clan heirs were all in the same class was interesting news to contemplate for later. Naruto mused as the Ukiya in question walked in half an hour early and sat down in what was obviously his place, about halfway up the room by one of the windows that let the Konoha sunshine into the room. He was also the first to arrive, apart from Naruto, of course, who was hidden under a minor genjutsu up at the back of the room, and had been there almost an hour before the academy was due to start to ensure he was the first to arrive. He could not cast genjutsu properly himself, of course, due to his horrendous chakra control, despite his and Kage's attempts to fix that issue. And as such, the genjutsu was created by the brooch on his long jacket that Kage had inscribed for him. All he had to do was supply the chakra to power the illusion, which made those who looked at him to want to look elsewhere, as well as making them forget they had seen him. A rather nifty, if chakra-heavy technique. It was almost 5 minutes before the next arrival, a civilian girl that he thought was called Hitomi. In that time, he was surprised to see the Ukiya pull out a book of all things, one that was a suspense thriller about a group of Black Ops ninja during the Third Shinobi War, something he did not think that the Ukiya would indulge in if he were to listen to the girls that followed him as they did. That changed, of course, the moment that Hitomi entered. The book was in the Ukiya's bag and out of sight with speed that was very impressive, the Ukiya adopting a brooding pose that Naruto seemed to get the idea was the norm for him. Over the next 20 minutes, people filtered into the room. None of them noticed him. Even the Hyuga girl who had been nervous would activate her dojutsu, the all-seeing eye or Baikugan, which allowed her to see chakra in a 360 dome around her, and as his genjutsu was brimming with chakra, it would have been plainly obvious to her. The classroom finally was full with only a few minutes before 9 a.m., the only gaps the seats either side of Naruto. The Chunin teacher, whose name was Yumino Irika Naruto had found after a bit of digging, entered with 2 minutes to go and stood at the front of the class, obviously waiting for silence from the children in front of him. After 30 seconds of continued murmuring, Irika had obviously had enough, and him suddenly spoke up, his face morphing into a giant demonic version of his normal face, his voice loud and scary, without him having to shout out for the class to be silent. Naruto was impressed with such an interesting seal, less genjutsu, or he at least hoped it was a genjutsu, otherwise that was a worrying bloodline to have. It certainly quieted the class down, every one of them looking at the Chunin in shocked silence. Knowing that he now had their full attention, Irika's head returned to its normal size, and he opened the register on his desk to check that all the students were present. He called out their names until he called out Sasuke's name, and then he paused, looking at the name below in obvious shock. Naruto Uzumaki. People looked around in confusion at the unfamiliar name, though he did notice that Sakura and a couple of the others recognized the name. He sighed and removed the flow of chakra to his bracelet, breaking the genjutsu and revealing himself as he stood up and stated loudly, "Here, Irika-sensei." The reactions to his appearance were certainly amusing to the boy, and it was all he could do to stop himself laughing out loud as the people on either side on him falling out of their seats from shock. Several of the girls screamed. Boys shouted in what they would later claim was a manly way, and one poor girl fainted, certainly not what you would expect as a reaction from students in their last year of training before becoming battle-ready mercenaries. The only three that reacted appropriately in Naruto's opinion was Sasuke, who was on his feet at the surprise appearance behind him, hand going to his kunai pouch in a good instinctual reaction. The surprises to Naruto, however, were Sakura and Hinata, the latter leaping up into the gap between rows whilst activating her Byakugan, with the former actually loosed a kunai in his direction as she twirled round in her seat. He caught the kunai by the ring only a few inches from his face composed even as Irika finally relaxed enough to rein his instincts that had been itching for him to throw a blade himself at the trespasser. Naruto then walked out of the row of desks, down the steps with the whole class watching him somewhat apprehensively. He stopped in front of Sakura and held out the kunai, speaking in a deadbeat tone. "I believe this is yours, Harino-san." She grabbed it quickly, blushing slightly as she averted her eyes quickly out of embarrassment. Then in another moment, Naruto was back in his seat in a burst of speed that many of the academy students could not follow, though Irika had watched him with something approaching distrust and worry. It was only through happenstance that Naruto knew the reason why Irika would look at him like that, him and most of the adults in the village. It was during his time training with Kage-sensei out in the wilds of the Country of Fire. Flashback. It had been almost 6 months since the two strange companions had been traveling the Country of Fire. After almost 2 weeks since they had left the hidden village, Kage had finally come clean about the fact that he had technically kidnapped him from Konoha. Naruto had taken it surprisingly well, only trying to run away back to the village once, before Kage tied him up and explained that the Hokage had given the trip the go-ahead as long as Naruto wrote regular letters to him about his training. The querying of this announcement had been the subject of the first of those letters to the Hokage, and Naruto had only truly calmed down when he had received the reply, courtesy of Kage's shades that regularly went to and from major outposts in the country, detailing in each mail item he sent to the Hokage, where he would be calling it next and when, so that responses could be written well in time to be delivered. With that minor issue out of the way, Kage had then truly started him with his training, beginning with a harsh physical training regime that soon even had Naruto's somewhat impressive stamina on the brink of failure. Though Naruto had to admit that the results were hard to ignore, after 3 months Kage had stated that his body strength was up to that of a Uzun Ninja graduate, so it was now time to work on the other aspects that contributed to shinobi life. They then worked on tactics and knowledge, history of the great nations, and the politics of the current villages and nations. When Naruto asked why he needed to learn such things as they didn't help him become a super kick-ass shinobi, Kage had pointed out that the Hokage was required to know these things in order to not accidentally anger a powerful noble or village leader and therefore bring war to his village and his people. Naruto quickly knuckled down after that, though he could tell that his difficulties with the material were driving Kage crazy. Still, they persevered with it until it reached the point that Kage snapped. It wasn't really Naruto's fault that Kage had lost his patience, but trying to teach the boy anything book-based without regular breaks of physical exertion was probably the hardest thing Kage had ever been through. With concentrated theory working considered an impossibility, Kage then worked out a new plan for training. After thinking on it for almost 2 days, during which he ran Naruto ragged with his shades, a secret technique of his clans that allowed for him to create solid clones that can think for themselves and use their chakra to form techniques, Kage decided that it would be a good idea to teach Naruto some basic techniques before building up to his shade technique. They were fairly chakra intensive to use, but all the ninja of Yuzu were known for their larger than normal chakra capacities. So whilst Kage could not throw them around like he could some of his techniques, they were not exhausting for him to utilize on a regular basis. So the next month was spent on teaching Naruto 3 techniques and trying to teach him several more. Naruto took to the Kaorimi Jutsu and the Henge Jutsu like a fish to water, and after an hour all Kage could say for him to improve upon regarding the techniques was that he used far too much chakra to complete the technique, causing a massive cloud of smoke to erupt when the switch was made. The flash jutsu, a simple technique that produced a flash of powerful white light upon completion, was something that Kage considered vital for him to learn, though why it was so important was never explained. It was the clone jutsu that Naruto had been able to get down, and Kage had surmised that this was possibly due to his chakra's instability, its density changing and warping from instant to instant. This in itself wasn't a bad thing. It just meant that for such low chakra cost techniques, it was very hard to not accidentally overload them. In an attempt to help Naruto master his chakra somewhat more, as well as to hopefully allow Kage some semblance of peace, Kage had sat him down and instructed in the art of meditation. It had been a difficult task to achieve with Naruto's energy levels and seemingly permanent hyperactivity, but eventually Naruto had managed to get the concepts down and would spend an hour every day calming his chakra, sinking deeper and deeper into the stance each time. This continued until eventually he woke to find himself not in the field he and Kage had been training in, but in a strange building, almost sewer-like base of the structure, the pipes of blue and red that littered the walls, and finally the water that pooled on the floor. Looking down the corridors, he noticed a light glowing from one end of the passageway, and mildly curious at what was happening to him, having already flexed his chakra in the way that Kage had taught him to dispel Jinjutsu to no effect. He walked slowly down the path, his feet splashing on the watery ground, though he did not notice any sensation of water splashing him from the movements he was making, but shrugged it off for now. He could work it out more later. Reaching the light, he found it was in fact a glowing set of bars, easily 100 times his height, and each one of the 20 bars easily twice his width, inscribed with kanji so dense that it was only by stepping forward he was able to distinguish it was they that were glowing rather than the entire bar. As he had stepped forwards, something moved in the darkness in what Naruto a moment later designated as a cage, as he had to leap backwards very quickly to avoid a giant claw, one of 3 attached to the massive paw that spread itself around 2 of the bars in order to fit. Righting himself whilst turning to eye his attacker, Naruto couldn't help the shiver that went up his spine as he found himself staring up at the grinning visage of a giant red-furred fox, whose eyes were filled with amusement and anger. "So close, though you're here to visit me earlier than I thought, so I can be forgiven for being unprepared, can I, my little jailer?" In flashback, that had been one of the most terrifying experiences in Naruto's short life. And once he had revealed it to Kage upon managing to exit what they had discovered to be his mindscape, the masked man had told him not to try and contact it again. He had met Biju containers before, and the more they had used their Biju's chakra, the more mad and dangerous they had seemed to become, not only to their enemies, but also their allies and the innocent bystanders that might be around them when they called upon their inmates' chakra, another thing that Naruto did not want to happen in the slightest. He was glad he knew at least now why everyone had hated him when he was younger, and why some of them were still wary of him now he had returned. He was broken by his musing, by his reflexes, screaming at him that something was coming towards him from the front of the class. Without thinking, having been tested many times by Kage for his reflexes, he grabbed the offending object and threw it back with the addition of some chakra in the direction it had come. There was a crash, and looking for the first time at what had happened, he found himself looking at the amazed eyes of the entire class. Irika shifted so that he was side-on, having just avoided the blackboard wider that had been thrown by him at Naruto. For some reason or other, the offending object, now embedded in the wall behind the now-shattered blackboard, an eruption of chalk being the only movement for a moment. Scratching the back of his head, Naruto smiled apologetically and then spoke quickly. "Sorry, Irika-sensei. Did you want something?" Previously on Shade of Yuzu. That had been one of the most terrifying experiences in Naruto's short life. And once he had revealed it to Kage upon managing to exit what they had discovered to be his mindscape, the masked man had told him not to try and contact it again. He had met Biju containers before, and the more they had used their Biju's chakra, the more mad and dangerous they had seemed to become, not only to their enemies, but also their allies and the innocent bystanders that might be around them when they called upon their inmates' chakra, another thing that Naruto did not want to happen in the slightest. He was glad he knew at least now why everyone had hated him when he was younger, and why some of them were still wary of him now he had returned. He was broken by his musing, by his reflexes, screaming at him that something was coming towards him from the front of the class. Without thinking, having been tested many times by Kage for his reflexes, he grabbed the offending object and threw it back with the addition of some chakra in the direction it had come. There was a crash, and looking for the first time at what had happened, he found himself looking at the amazed eyes of the entire class. Irika shifted so that he was side-on, having just avoided the blackboard wider that had been thrown by him at Naruto. For some reason or other, the offending object now embedded in the wall behind the now shattered blackboard, an eruption of chalk being the only movement for a moment. Scratching the back of his head, Naruto smiled apologetically and then spoke quickly. "Sorry, Irika-sensei, did you want something?" Consequence of an act. After his rather unique form of introducing himself to his classmates, it was little surprise that the class gave him a wide berth both inside and outside the classroom. Some of them were probably doing so on command from their parents. Naruto thought rather wryly as he walked up to his usual spot at the top right seat of the classroom, past a civilian boy that glared silently at him. The Sandame's law had indeed stopped any of the adults from mentioning the case of Naruto being the container directly, but Gigi had obviously underestimated the hate and ingenuity of a good portion of the civilian populace. They had carefully and indirectly poisoned the minds of their children against the object of their hate and fear, and by the wonders of peer pressure, that dislike and avoidance had spread through the academy before he had left like wildfire, and his return seemed to have refueled that hate, if not to the same levels that it had been before now. Though that only accounted for some of the avoidance, Naruto thought as Sakura entered the class, looked up at where he was sitting for a moment before realizing he was looking at her, and looked down whilst taking her seemingly usual seat at the front of the class. The odd behavior from what Naruto remembered to be an intelligent but very confident and outspoken girl confused Naruto for a moment, but he shook it off as a part of girls' progress through puberty, something he wouldn't understand now and hoped he never would. The other girls seemed to be copying the actions of the last Uchiha, who seemed to have taken to glowering at Naruto at every possibility. He guessed it was because the boy suspected that Naruto had been present to seeing him break his favored ice-cold demeanor with his choice of reading material. If asked about the Uchiha and his opinion on the boy, Naruto would simply reply that he disliked the boy because of how much special attention the boy had evidently received in order to get to the level of prodigy that everyone crowed about round the walls of Konoha. Thus far, he had seen the specialist teachers for ninjutsu, traps and evasion, stealth, and the fitness instructor all give the boy extra 1-to-1 training during class, to the detriment of those that actually needed it, as well as demonstrating to him special moves and advanced techniques that they never share with the rest of the class. Only Irika did not favor the boy in the slightest during lessons, and to Naruto's surprise, the Uchiha seemed to pay more attention in these classes, listening attentively, and occasionally asking muttered questions at the end of class to Irika or the assistant teacher Mizuki. This seeming defiance of the pampering that he seemed to realize that he was receiving did not stop it happening. Naruto noted as the Jinjutsu teacher went over the practical applications of the cancellation technique for the dozenth time in less than a month of teaching the subject, not even approaching the idea of casting a Jinjutsu or having one cast upon them. The official line for that was that the academy did not want to use even the lowest forms of Jinjutsu, as they might scare or otherwise emotionally scar the students before they were truly ready to face shinobi life after graduating the academy. Civilian appeasing bullcrap, if you asked Naruto. If the genin that graduated did not get a Jinjutsu specialist sensei, then they would fall prey to the weakest of Jinjutsu casters once they were out on missions. Kage had spent almost 3 months casting Jinjutsu of various types on him in order to gather him, used to detecting the presence of Jinjutsu due to the presence of foreign chakra in his chakra system. Even with that combined experience, it was still a hit and miss affair as to whether Naruto had any idea he was in a Jinjutsu, and shoddy control still caused him a number of issues in regards to dispelling them even if he could detect them. But he pushed his thoughts about his deficiencies to one side as the class bell rang, and the teacher, whose name had forgotten and probably never would find worth remembering whilst here in the academy, finally stopped droning on and waved his hand dismissively, as if shooing the class away so that they did not distract him any further. Naruto would normally be annoyed about being ignored, but his excitement for the next class overrode this reaction quite firmly as he almost bounced out of the room. The reason for his excitement? Taijutsu class, of course, what else? For the last 3 weeks, they had gone over the advanced katas of the Konoha Academy style, which Naruto had not participated in as he had his own style that he had been working on. The style of the Uzumaki's Kage had told him as he had tortured the boy through the first 4 katas. With his non-participation, everyone had assumed that he was not at all strong with taijutsu, not that Naruto had minded that assumption, going as far as to bring his katana to classes to make it seem that he was working on weapon proficiency rather than hand-to-hand combat. If people had the wrong ideas about his capabilities, then that would only help him should he need to fight them for whatever reason. Something he would need to keep in mind today, as today was the first session in which the members of the class would get to practice their skills physically against each other. Whilst he wanted to test himself against someone other than Kage, who crushed him so convincingly every time they sparred, it was a wonder that he had any confidence in his skill. He wished to keep his known skills at a minimum, lest people start up about his strength being because of the fox trapped in his stomach. As such, he hoped for an easy pairing today, as that would allow for him to win convincingly without too much effort. Though he somehow doubted he would be so lucky, as he led the group out onto the training grounds where Irika and Mizuki were waiting for them. Irika spoke, smile on his face as he regarded those in front of him. Afternoon class, I hope you are all ready for this, your first proper observed battle. Everyone will be against randomized opponents. And for the first 6 months, we'll keep it as boy versus boy and girl versus girl until you're all a little more experienced. The rules are simple. Taijutsu only. No ninjutsu or clan techniques or chakra enhancements. The winner is the one who incapacitates their opponent or forces them outside of the ring. As we progress, we will allow the use of techniques and weapons, and then we will have a tournament halfway through the year to determine the best taijutsu user of the year after the Academy Field Course and Fomission, of course. Everyone understand? Everyone nodded, some visibly much more eager for a fight than others were. Primarily the Inuzuka and Uchiha boys were limbering up and getting themselves ready. Though from the look on Sakura's face as she glared at a couple of the other civilian girls, he imagined that she was pretty eager to settle a score as well. Irika then motioned to one side. If everyone who is not fighting can stay well away from the ring and not try to distract either fighter whilst the fight is occurring, then you will be allowed to spectate. If any of you cause trouble from the sidelines, you will be forced to go and wait inside. Now, the first 2 fighters of the afternoon. Irika named off 2 of the civilian boys who entered into the ring, bowing to each other and then forming academy stances. Irika commented on each of the stances and what could be improved before beginning the fight. The 2 began tentatively, their opening exchange dominated by ranging punches and kicks before the 2 got more and more involved in the fight. Despite Irika's repeated exclamations to return to the correct stance, the 2 slowly began to revert to a more natural brawl that left both badly bruised even before one of them managed to land a heavy punch to the other's face, leaving him on the floor with a bloody nose. Irika called the fight, giving both a lecture on proper form and its uses before sending them both to the infirmary for treatment. The next match was between Ino Yamanaka and Ami, a match that the blonde girl dominated with moves that she had obviously learned from her family, whilst Ami performed with a passable style, but was obviously unused to facing someone in combat, and, as such, was easily confused by the different styles she was faced with. In less than 2 minutes, Ami was thrown on her back on the floor, Irika turning to lecture the class on the different styles that they might face on the battlefield, whilst Ino had flicked her hair in an egoistic way before leaving the ring to the cries of several boys who were obviously enamored by her. Without thinking about it, Naruto stepped into the ring towards the down girl, noting out of the corner of his eye both Chunin stiffening in response before Irika continued as if nothing had happened. Ami seemed to be watching him carefully as well, and flinched slightly as he stuck out his hand to help her up before accepting it tentatively and pulling herself up. She pulled herself up quite forcefully and pulled herself into him before either of them realized it. A moment later, she was heading out of the ring with a muffled thanks directed towards him, her face bright red. There was muttering throughout the class at this little interaction. Though Naruto shrugged off the looks easily enough, he had been doing it for as long as he could remember after all. 3 fights later, and 2 of them had been dominated by the major clan heirs, though the Nara heir had come close to giving up at the start of his match, before being reminded by Irika that he would have informing his mother of the results of the fight, and Naruto was wondering whether this class was just entirely against the civilians that made up 2/3 of its group, as the clans had a very obvious advantage when it came to outside help. Then Irika mentioned his name, and his attention snapped back to the scarred Chunin. Yes, Irika-sensei? Irika sighed before repeating himself. The 5th match, Naruto Uzumaki versus Kiba Inuzuka, is what I said if you had been listening. Nodding to himself as much as to assenting to Irika's statement, Naruto leapt up from where he had been sat thinking and stepped once more into the ring, his opponent a well-built, feral-looking boy who had been accompanied everywhere by his pet dog. From what Kage had told him, the Inuzuka were very proficient at taijutsu, especially with their clan techniques and partners to work with. Whilst lacking both of these, Kiba was not to be underestimated, as he leapt forward the moment Irika began the match, teeth bared in his elongated nails, almost like claws at the ready. Naruto started out defensive, parrying the boy's sweeping attacks with his hands, and dodging the powerful kicks that were evidently meant to open up his defenses for the clawing attacks to have an effect. If it weren't for the fact that Kaguya had trained him very vigorously in taijutsu and endurance techniques throughout the training trip, Naruto knew that he would have probably been overwhelmed by the furious assault. But instead he was comfortable with his moves, deflecting them until an opening appeared in Kiba's defenses, which Naruto capitalized on. A powerful palm strike, sending Kiba backwards, wheezing and grasping his stomach with one hand for a moment before recovering and taking a stance. Once more. The next attack was more guarded, and the 2 boys traded strikes with each other for the next 30 seconds. Kiba's endurance beginning to flag as Naruto rained blow after blow onto the boy's guard, forcing the boy back step after step, Naruto upping the intensity as Kiba approached the rim of the taijutsu ring in his attempts to gain some distance between the 2 fighters. With Kiba barely 2 paces from the edge, Naruto suddenly changed tactics, ducking down and kicking out hard. He caught the boy in a midsection with a devastating kick that lifted him into the air and out of the ring, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. There was silence for a moment at this result, and Naruto knew that it was the Chunin that were the most shocked, his academy report from his first 2 years telling the tale that he was terrible at taijutsu, but he had just destroyed one of the taijutsu specialist clan members in the class, without even breaking a sweat. The best part for Naruto was that he had not even been forced to use the Uzumaki style, sticking with the general punches, kicks, and parries that Kaguya had taught him as a precursor to the actual style, meaning that he hadn't given away anything other than some of his speed, strength, and endurance, which was not very informative to anyone who did not know him well. Finally shaking himself out of what had been a group-wide stupor, Irika spoke even as he hurried to check on the down boy. Winner by ring eviction, Naruto Uzumaki. Mizuki, you continue the session from here. I have to take Kiba to the infirmary for treatment. He might have cracked a couple of ribs on his landing. Without another word, he activated a Shushin and disappeared from the training grounds. Mizuki stepped forward and picked up Irika's clipboard from where he had dropped it, looking at the assigned pairings while shooing Naruto out of the ring with a dismissive wave. Making a mental note to hold back more in the future if he had actually injured his classmate that much, Naruto headed out of the ring back to his original position off to the side. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the rest of the class gave him a respectful berth after that display, and a teaching point from Kage entered his head. It is good for both your allies and your enemies to respect your power that brings peace, but only your enemies should fear your power, lest your allies end up turning on you because of that fear. With that echoing his head all of a sudden, Naruto took it as a sign that he had probably taken his new image a little too far, and that perhaps working to get to know his classmates would not be the worst thing in the world for him to do. The problem was that with the record he had given himself, changing that around suddenly would be very difficult to achieve in the short run. He continued to think on the matter as the remaining bouts occurred, with all the clan heirs winning comfortably, and the civilian-on-civilian matches being a lot closer in comparison. The only surprise was Sakura's match, which was against one of the girls that she had been glaring at before. Using perfect taijutsu and surprising flexibility, Sakura had her opponent pinned to the floor rather painfully in less than a minute, before standing embarrassedly and apologizing in a quiet tone, before leaving the arena to sit by herself once more under the cold looks of what were obviously the defeated girl's friends. Something was happening there that Naruto was missing. That much was certain, though he wished to avoid trying to be friends with Sakura to begin with, in case she took it as a sign that he hadn't lost his crush on her and tried to return to her old way of treating him, something that Naruto would definitely not stand for this time around. The bell rang, signaling the end of the day, and Naruto took the opportunity to depart straight away, heading towards the training ground that, as far as he was aware, had been disused for some time, or so he had discovered whilst using it thus far. He needed to think further on how to change his attitude in order to be able to befriend at least some of his classmates. As Naruto leapt off, he was unaware of the pair of eyes that had been watching him keenly since he had won his match. With the utmost stealth, the owner of the pair of eyes leapt up onto the roof after Naruto, determined to put the dope back in the place he had been before he had mysteriously disappeared for 2 years, Onyx's eyes flashing with determination and anger as the figure followed at a reasonable distance. Arriving in the training grounds, Naruto started with a few basic exercises before settling himself into the meditation pose that Kage had taught him in order to calm his rather chaotic chakra. Breathing deeply and clearing his mind, he was just about to relax when he heard someone shift on the edge of the clearing he was currently in. Straining his senses, he caught a familiar smell and frowned even as he called out irritably, "What are you doing here, Uchiha-san?" Previously on Shades of Yuzu. As Naruto leapt off, he was unaware of the pair of eyes that had been watching him keenly since he had won his match. With the utmost stealth, the owner of the pair of eyes leapt up onto the roof after Naruto, determined to put the dope back in the place he had been before he had mysteriously disappeared for 2 years, Onyx's eyes flashing with determination and anger as the figure followed at a reasonable distance. Arriving in the training grounds, Naruto started with a few basic exercises before settling himself into the meditation pose that Kage had taught him in order to calm his rather chaotic chakra. Breathing deeply and clearing his mind, he was just about to relax when he heard someone shift on the edge of the clearing he was currently in. Straining his senses, he caught a familiar smell and frowned even as he called out irritably, "What are you doing here, Uchiha-san?" Chapter 6. Confrontation and... After a few moments with no response, Naruto was tempted to stand, mainly to go beat some manners into the boy, before he heard the inhalation and the rapid movement that could only be associated with the technique. Leaping to one side, eyes open and furious, Naruto was proved right a moment later when the area he had been sat in exploded into flames. Glaring at the dark-haired boy as he leapt down from the trees, Naruto growled out his question even as he assumed the first stance of the Uzumaki style, a defensive one designed to open up the enemy to counterattacks with sweeping blocks and deflections. "What the hell, Uchiha? I ask you a simple question and you try and flame me? Not cool, psycho." For a second, Naruto thought he was not going to get a response and readied himself before the Uchiha finally spoke. "I will tell you why, if you beat me." And with that, he flung himself forward, covering the distance with surprising swiftness. Naruto was on the back foot. That much was certain from the first few exchanges. Whilst he was not as strong as Kiba, Sasuke made up for it in terms of speed and skill, his taijutsu very advanced, and unknown to Naruto, probably a much more advanced version of the leaf style that some adoring chunin had instructed him in. It was very compact, and Sasuke left no openings as he pressed his attacks further and faster against Naruto's defenses. After a couple of minutes, Sasuke leapt backwards if anything seemingly more angry at Naruto than he had been at the start. "Why are you not fighting?" the boy roared before flinging 2 kunai with his left hand, running forward with 2 more being readied in his right. Naruto caught the first projectile and used it to deflect the second in a spinning motion, bringing himself to face his opponent once more just in time to dodge the opening slashes with the 2 kunai. Drawing another kunai, Naruto settled himself into a more balanced style than the first one he had used, and the 2 struck backwards and forwards for a minute. It was Sasuke that made the first mistake in his obvious rage at the situation. One of his strikes with his left arm was overextended, allowing Naruto to disarm his blade in that hand before flipping the Uchiha with that hand over onto his back. Acting before the Uchiha could react, Naruto stamped his foot onto the Uchiha's right wrist, causing him to drop the other kunai with a yelp. At the same time, Naruto brought one of his kunai to the boy's neck, causing him to freeze in place, fear obvious in his features. Breathing heavily after what had been the best match he had had with anyone other than Kage, Naruto still spoke furiously at the one that had attacked him, almost tempted to activate the Kage clan technique that Kage had taught him, the Mask of Shadows, just to add to the effect. "Now that I have your undivided attention, I shall ask again, you little psycho, why did you attack me for no good reason? And answer quickly lest I lose my patience. That would not end well for you." That got a reaction, and the Uchiha snarled at him. "You wouldn't dare. I am the Uchiha." He cut off as Naruto's blade cut lightly into his throat, something in his eyes beginning to change and glow red as Naruto replied in his best intimidating tone. "Try me. It would make my day, possibly my week. If I chose, no one would ever find your body." This was a calculated bluff on Naruto's part. He only meant to knock the boy out and present him to the Hokage on the charge of attempted murder. But if the boy thought that he was serious about the body thing, that was his problem. Counting down from 5, Naruto couldn't help but grin when at 3 seconds Sasuke cried out in a rather feminine voice for him to stop, though he presumed that it could well be the stress of the situation that had caused it. He withdrew his kunai and stepped backwards, leaving Sasuke to rub his throat gingerly with his uninjured hand. After another moment, Sasuke spoke up, his voice back to its usual gruff tone. "I wish to find out if the match with Kiba today had been a fluke, or whether the rumors were true, that you had been taken by some night demon and trained to hold terrible power, as you're no longer the dobe you were before you left." The boy stopped speaking, but the insinuation was obvious. Naruto chuckled to himself. Kage would love to have gained the moniker Night Demon in addition to all his other titles. "So that is your defense for trying to kill me? You wish to find out if I had got a lot stronger." Sasuke shook his head before Naruto could rail on him for his stupidity. "If you had looked like you weren't going to move, I would have fired the fireball elsewhere. I'm not that stupid idiot. The other reason was that you proved to be a true challenge. You don't hold back like everyone else does, not wanting to hurt their precious Uchiha. I thought if I fought you, then maybe I would gain my clan's bloodline, which supposedly only awakens in life or death situations." Looking into the boy's now red eyes, each with a single tomo present to form part of the iris, Naruto had to admit that the Uchiha's surprisingly impassioned speech made a lot of sense, especially as it seemed to have worked, not that the Uchiha seemed to have noticed. Pocketing one of his kunai, Naruto grabbed the small pocket mirror that Kage had insisted he carry in order to use it to look around corners without exposing himself to detection. Holding it out to the Uchiha, he spoke a lot more cheerfully than he had thus far. "Well, this is twice you owe me then, one for not planning on reporting this attack, and the other favor, well, it's best if you see it for yourself." Looking confusedly at Naruto, obviously unsure of what he meant, Sasuke grasped the mirror, looking at it for a moment before obvious understanding passed over his face and a grin formed on his face. If Naruto hadn't been expecting the leaping attack in response to this revelation, he wasn't sure that he would have been able to react in time to parry it. Sasuke was even faster now, and seemed hell-bent on repaying Naruto for his earlier defeat. Naruto fell back step after step, pushed to his very limits, as Sasuke seemed able to predict what he was about to do before he did it. He had already taken 2 hits to the chest and a kick to the face, one that had left his lip bleeding lightly, and that was before Sasuke returned his idea of using dual kunai. Knowing he wouldn't be able to defend himself properly with just kunai, Naruto used the momentary pause in Sasuke's attack, generated by his reaching for his pouch to leap back and bring his hand to his sword. Kaguya was a short sword user, but was proficient in most types of weapons that one would be considered easily found in the elemental nations. As such, he had got Naruto to practice with several weapons to find out which he was most comfortable with before training him in that weapon primarily. The result was the no-dachi strapped to his waist. It wasn't a full no-dachi, shortened to suit Naruto's size and build, but the concepts behind its use were the same. As such, Naruto focused on the first of the techniques that Kaguya had taught him, and the only one that Kaguya claimed that he was passable in. The lion's roar technique was simple drawing technique that required on sheer speed and a little chakra enhancement. As Sasuke charged forward into range, Naruto drew his blade with all the speed he could muster, slashing first upwards and then back downwards in one smooth action. Taking a step forwards to extend the second swipe's range as he did so, its speed such that his own eyes could barely keep up with a blur, and he knew where it was going. Sasuke somehow saw the technique despite its speed and attempted to dodge backwards to avoid the swipes. He actually managed to avoid the first blow entirely, though the second sliced his shirt open and left a light cut along his torso. Sasuke finished leaping back as Naruto sheathed his blade once more, hoping that the display had brought the Uchiha back to earth. His thoughts stopped in his tracks, however, as the breeze in the area picked up, blowing Sasuke's shirt to either side of his body, leaving Naruto staring in shock at what was in front of him. Sasuke looked ready to continue before he realized that Naruto was staring dumbly at him. Following Naruto's gaze to its point of interest, Sasuke immediately dropped both of his kunai and tried to close his t-shirt and cover himself from Naruto's eyes with a very girl-like shriek of shock and embarrassment. The damage had already been done, however, as was proved by Naruto's rather shocked exclamation a moment later. "Sasuke, why the hell do you have breasts?" Sasuke somehow saw the technique despite its speed and attempted to dodge backwards to avoid the swipes. He actually managed to avoid the first blow entirely, though the second sliced his shirt open and left a light cut along his torso. Sasuke finished leaping back as Naruto sheathed his blade once more, hoping that the display had brought the Uchiha back to earth. His thoughts stopped in his tracks, however, as the breeze in the area picked up, blowing Sasuke's shirt to either side of his body, leaving Naruto staring in shock at what was in front of him. Sasuke looked ready to continue before he realized that Naruto was staring dumbly at him. Following Naruto's gaze to its point of interest, Sasuke immediately dropped both of his kunai and tried to close his t-shirt and cover himself from Naruto's eyes with a very girl-like shriek of shock and embarrassment. The damage had already been done, however, as was proved by Naruto's rather shocked exclamation a moment later. "Sasuke, why the hell do you have breasts?" Revelations of an unexpected kind. Naruto fell silent after his exclamation, leaving the two in silence for a moment, both turning red for different reasons. Sasuke finally responded, spitting such was his fury. "I thought the answer to that would be obvious, even to you, Dobe." He then cut off as if realizing something, even as Naruto posed his own guess at what the boy meant. "Does it mean that you are one of those weird boy-girl people that Irika-sensei was teaching us about Ahima?" As Naruto trailed off, try to remember what the word was that Irika had used, Sasuke sputtered in embarrassment before shouting back at him. "I'm not one of those things. I am fully female, thank you very much." Sasuke then seemed to realize what he had said as he quieted with a quiet meep, leaving Naruto to try and wrap his brain round what he had just discovered. "But why would you hide that you are a girl?" As he said it, Naruto was taken back to what he had overheard a few days after his return, just before he had started at the academy. Flashback. Leaping from rooftop to rooftop, in an effort to try and familiarize himself with the village once more, Naruto paused as he saw a small crowd forming in one of the squares. Leaping down, he had been disappointed when he had found it simply to be the Uchiha going about his daily business. Groups of young girls following him in what had to be what they assumed to be inconspicuously. Just as he was about to leap off once more, he heard a man comment to his wife. "I'm honestly very glad that our daughter isn't in him, dear. I mean, not only is he under threat of his brother coming back to finish the job, but in a few years' time the council will start making demands that he start on rebuilding his clan, and there's only so much the Hokage can do to stop them from picking him marriages and girls to be with if he doesn't find any himself by that point. It could be worse though, I suppose. At least he is a male." Naruto had lost interest at that point and had taken off back to his scouting. In flashback, the realization hit him like a brick, and he actually gasped before recovering. Before he said anything else, he undid his black jacket that Kage had bought him, holding it out toward Sasuke, whose expression changed from rage to that of confusion very quickly. After a moment of nothing happening, Naruto spoke in order to clarify his action. "You can put this on. It will be better for both of us if we have this conversation whilst you're not trying to cover yourself." Understanding crossed her face, and she stepped forwards, Naruto turning his gaze away as she grabbed it with a muttered thanks. After another moment's pause, Sasuke spoke once more. "I suppose I now find myself in the horrible position of being in your debt, Naruto-san. That is assuming you plan on not telling everyone about my secret." As Naruto began to turn his head to answer, he found her hands holding his head in place away from her. "I need you to answer a few more questions before I can let you turn back around, Naruto-san, so I know whether I can trust you." Naruto shrugged, an action that is surprisingly difficult with your head being held in place. "Whatever you say, Sasuke, though what is with the san all of a sudden?" Her response contained a hint of resignation. "I am hoping if I show you some more respect, it may help you decide to help me, but I can go back to Dobe if you prefer, Naruto-san. Now answer the question, will you keep my secret?" Well, that was an easy enough question to answer, and thus he replied without hesitation. "Of course I will, Sasuke-chan. I know why you hide yourself now, and I wouldn't wish what would happen if you were found out upon anyone, even the idiot janitor at the academy." There was a small giggle, something that seemed so out of place in Naruto's head with the Sasuke. He knew it was unnerving. At least we can agree on that point. "My next question is, what do you wish in return for your silence?" That one stumped him for a moment. What the hell was she talking about? Then he remembered a point from Kage that had been brought during his lessons on diplomacy. Everyone expects something for doing nothing. Ninja expect a lot for not spreading secrets they know. It's all about the prices both sides bring to the table as to whether he gives up the secret he possesses. With this in mind, Naruto decided that continuing to be honest was the best tactic. "Honestly, I want nothing from you. I found out something. It is important to keep it secret, otherwise you will be in a lot of trouble and in a very bad situation. I would hope for the same should anyone know one of my secrets." That obviously surprised her, and he felt the hands holding his head remove themselves before grabbing his shoulders and turning him to face her, her eyes ablaze and Sharingan whirling. "Do you mean that honestly? I will know if you are lying. That's one of the things that the Sharingan helps me detect." He nodded his head vigorously. "Of course I am. What could you give me that I want anyways?" That brought another disbelieving look from the girl, the disbelief stretching into her reply. "Apart from me being the sole heir of a powerful and prestigious clan whose coffers are still decently filled with the income of the shops who rent from me, my mind boggles at the lack of possibilities available to you in this situation." Okay, it was official. Regardless of her gender, Sasuke had a way of making Naruto feel completely dumb, something that he liked to think was not that easy to do. He quirked his eyebrow questioningly. "Would it just be easier for you to accept if I did ask for something? Because if this takes much longer, then we are probably going to get in trouble with the AMBU patrols when we try to get home." That point brought the tint of red to her cheeks, and she let go of him hastily. "You are correct. I should be grateful to you for your generosity. But here I am trying to force you to accept something. I will not try again, I swear, but I do have a question to ask of you, if you would grant me it." After being attacked, screamed at, attacked again, and then interrogated, being asked a question was a relief to Naruto at this point. "Of course, Sasuke-chan, as long as it isn't too ridiculous at this point, that is." She giggled, once more before turning away from him once more. Firstly, my name is actually Saki, not Sasuke. And secondly, as the only one of our generation who knows the truth about me, I need your opinion. She moved her hands, but as she was facing away from him, he couldn't make out what she was doing before she turned around once more, her tone light and amused. Does my haircut make me look less attractive like this? Should it be longer? Naruto struggled to remain conscious as he eyeballed Saki. She had obviously dispelled some technique or other, but her face had changed. The changes weren't huge by themselves, her cheekbones a little higher, her jaw less defined, her face overall a little narrower, but when combined together you were looking at someone else entirely. In addition, her hair, which had previously stuck up slightly and out to the sides, now fell flat, leaving her with a very attractive face and hair that covered her ears, but went no further in a surprisingly flattering look. She giggled once more, the smile changing her face even further. If someone had told him that this girl was the real Sasuke, he would have told them they were crazy. I didn't think it was possible to strike you dumb, Naruto-san. I thought that came naturally to you. The insult was made obviously in jest, so Naruto managed not to overreact, which is probably what she wanted at this point. He instead deflected to something else. I'm assuming you dispelled some sort of technique or other when you turn around, but the chakra cost would be too much for you to maintain all day. So I'm guessing a seal of some type? His insight surprised her. That much was obvious, but she nodded and then undid the top of his jacket, revealing a seal that was present on her shoulders on the front of her torso. Naruto tried to cover his eyes, but stopped when she shouted at him. Don't bother. It's nothing you haven't already seen, so there's no point in acting embarrassed after your little drooling session earlier. He flushed. That was true enough. The image of Sasuke's small but developing chest was firmly rooted in his head, and he doubted that he would be able to remove it for quite some time, not that he particularly wanted to. Lowering his hand, he approached and began to look at the seal closely, marveling at the complexity of the seal. Kaguya had only covered the basics of sealing, being an amateur himself who could only create the most basic of the seals he required. But he had told Naruto that the Uzumakis were renowned for their sealing skills, and thus Naruto's fascination with the subject began. Tracing a particular line that he thought connected two of the important functions, the charging function and the storage function, he noticed Saki shiver slightly, and it wasn't just because of his touch. Darkness was fast approaching, and with the clear sky that was typical of the Konoha summer nights, the temperature would plummet rapidly. With a sigh, he stepped back. Grabbing the zipper on his jacket, he pulled it up, covering Saki once more, though she still protested that she could do it herself. As much as I would love to work out how that seal works and all its little secrets, it's getting late, and we better get you back quickly before the ANBU appear in force. Last thing we want is for them to find you like this. She nodded, but looked a little worried. The problem is that the seal needs more time to charge before I can activate it once more. And if I use a hinge, they might sense it and apprehend me as a possible infiltrator, which is even worse. Naruto smiled reassuringly at her before grabbing her hand. Don't worry about that, Saki-chan. I have a technique that will get us into the Uchiha compound. All I need you to do is hold on tight to me and close your eyes. You really do not want to have them open through this. She looked at him intently for a moment before sighing and stepping in close to wrap herself around him in a hug. This had better not be an excuse for you to cop a feel, or you will regret it. That much I swear now. With a threat issued, she closed her eyes and rested her head on his shoulder with a grimace. Deciding not to wait a moment lest she think that he was trying to get fresh with her, he brought his hands up behind her back, forming hand seal after hand seal with meticulous precision. The technique was another of Kage's, and whilst useful, was one of the most chakra-intensive techniques that the masked man knew. It worked by casting the user and everyone and everything attached to them into a parallel dimension which was essentially made up of shadows and fire. It then brought them out once more in the location that Naruto had been thinking of, one of the courtyards in the Uchiha compound that he had seen whilst he had been scouting. The technique was very smooth, though it required huge amounts of energy, both to transport the mass of the caster and whoever he was with, and to erect a chakra shield around them to deter the denizens of the alternate realm from trying to snack upon them. After a few moments without her moving, Naruto realized that Saki probably didn't realize they had moved at all, and looking down, he was surprised to see a relatively soft smile on the girl's face, and loath he was to break it. He knew it was better to get her inside before a patrol passed by them. "Saki-chan, you can open your eyes now. We are here." She opened them slowly, before realizing that he was looking down at her. She sprang away from him, cheeks flushing even as she schooled her face into a neutral expression once more. Once she had done that, she looked around and realized that he was correct, and they had moved. She turned back to Naruto, eyeing him in an appraising manner that made Naruto want to shiver slightly. "A very impressive technique, Naruto-san. You do know that you're going to teach me that technique one way or another." Naruto shook his head negatively. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Saki-chan. I promised my teacher that I would only teach my family these techniques. They're all that is left of my village, after all." Okay, rather than put her off, that line of defense seemed to have made her more excited, if the predatory grin was anything to go by. She muttered something that he didn't catch, before turning away and pointing. "But enough about the technique for now. We can negotiate about it later, I'm sure. My home is this way, and I would quite like you to walk me there before you depart." Deciding to get a bit of teasing of his own in at this point, Naruto spoke in a teasing tone as he walked next to her, surprised when she slipped her hand into his lightly before squeezing slightly. "Ah, that's sweet, Saki-chan. With this and your expression earlier when we arrived, one could think that you liked me." He stopped as she gave him a look that promised him pain if he continued to speak about the subject, and he wisely dropped it before he could get himself in more trouble. They thus walked through the district in silence, passing through well-kept gardens and streets, before approaching a large three-story house on the edge of the compound, close to one of the gates leading through to the rest of Konoha. "This is where I live now. It used to be a storage building that I never went in, so after everything that happened, there are at least no memories to haunt me in here." Not sure of how else to react, Naruto settled for a reassuring smile while squeezing her hand reassuringly. A Sasuke with feelings would take a while to get used to, but it was better than the old Sasuke, that was sure. "Well, Saki-chan, you know where I am, and my door is always open should you need me. Just, if I do or say something stupid, please kill me quickly." That brought a smirk back to her face as she scoffed. "Don't count on it, Dobe. I will torture you as much as I like, and you won't complain in the slightest." She paused before looking at him seriously once more. "But seriously, thanks, Naruto, not just for keeping my secret. It is refreshing to finally have someone my own age to talk to once more, even if it is a smelly boy." The last bit was obviously said in jest, but he still pretended to take offense in an exaggerated manner. "What, me smelly? The good lady doth wound me with her words." She giggled, another thing he would have to adapt to, before squeezing his hand one last time, turning to head to the door. Turning the key she produced from her pouch, she opened the door whilst calling out once more, "Good night, Naruto, and I will see you at the same training grounds tomorrow after the academy. You've already proved more use than those buffoons that claim to be our teachers." And with that said, she was gone, leaving Naruto alone in the courtyard, his mind still in a whirl from the huge influx of information that he had taken in during the last couple of hours. Finally deciding to move back home, he supposed there was one good thing about the evening. At least he had made friends with one of his classmates. Even if he was not allowed to tell anyone about it in any way all. This section is something that may become a more routine thing, as the guest reviews I get raise good points that I can't reply to privately. So, they have to be done here. This review raised the question of why the seal did not cover Sasuke's chest, as well as altering the girl's face, as well as why no one in the general populace of Konoha knew that Saki was a girl before the massacre. The seal question, well, my reasoning is that it is much harder to alter something as large as a set of breasts into a boy's chest. Remember that these changes are not only visual, but also able to stand up to cursory touches. The seal is using Saki's chakra to power the jutsu, so the chakra requirements to power such a change will be far too large for a young girl's system to handle and still be able to use chakra for anything else. Therefore, presented with not being a ninja or having to hide her chest, it is no real surprise what Saki in my story chose. The before the massacre question, two things. Firstly, I believe that the clans in Konoha would be a lot more secretive than people seem to imagine, even in the anime. The idea that Niji airs the truth about the caged bird seal, something that seems to be present on 75% of the Hyuga clan members, and also seems to be the basis of the distrust and hate between the two branches, and everyone that has not experienced ninja seems shocked and appalled, is somewhat the proof to this. So if the clans are that secretive about something that I'm sure the branch Hyuga would love to be known across Konoha, then the idea that the heirs to a clan are protected somewhat from public knowledge is not a surprise, especially when everyone would be praising the work of the actual heir to the clan who is already a ninja by that point. This links with my second point, which is the attempted kidnap of Hinata by Kyumo. Now, if the idea of a female clan heir would have been difficult for a man like Fugaku to stomach before that event, then the idea that if news of Saki got out, then kidnappers might come after her to get their own Sharingans outside of Fugaku's control would be the decision-maker in the man's head. Of course, the other Uchiha would know, but they would follow the clan head's orders regardless of their own opinions on the idea, and thus a suitable deception in placed, and people are revealed to the idea of a second boy Uchiha heir. Anyone who had heard otherwise would quickly be hounded to change their story in a way that made them look like it was an attempt to embarrass the clan. This plan would have only been temporary, of course, until the girl was old enough to protect herself, and it could be revealed, but then the massacre happened, and those that knew the truth were dead, apart from Itachi. The Hokage would know along with a small set of trusted ninja that would have been guards, aides, and carers to the young Uchiha, but that would be the limit to those that know, making Naruto unique as the only one of his age group to know. End of review section. Previously on the shade of Yuzu. Turning the keys she produced from her pouch, she opened the door whilst calling out once more. Good night, Naruto, and I will see you at the same training grounds tomorrow after the academy. You've already proved more use than those buffoons that claim to be our teachers. And with that said, she was gone, leaving Naruto alone in the courtyard, his mind still in a whirl from the huge influx of information that he had taken in during the last couple of hours. Finally deciding to move back home, he supposed there was one good thing about the evening. At least he had made friends with one of his classmates, even if he was not allowed to tell anyone about it in any way. Chapter 8. Progress of a Kind. The next week passed relatively quickly, Naruto, a slow routine developing as he did so. After the surprise concerning Saki, he had decided not to try and befriend another person in his class until he had worked out how he stood in regards to the disguised girl. He also had a new project to work on, as after the first night the two had spent training together. Using taijutsu only, of course, for now, though Saki had shown an interest in learning how to use a blade like Naruto, he had asked to have another look at her seal so that he could copy it down. She had smirked before asking if he was just trying to get her topless again, leaving him red in the face before agreeing to show him. Shifting the top of her t-shirt so that he could see it, and grabbing parchment and pen, he set to work tracing the lines and squiggles that made up the seal in front of him. It had taken half an hour to copy it to his satisfaction, and afterwards Saki had insisted that he owed her for her patience regarding that little session, something that he had acknowledged easily enough. She had yet to call in that favor. Though he was sure she still had something in mind, it was just like her not to tell him what she had planned. The seal had taken up most of Naruto's free time when he wasn't with Sasuke or training by himself, and he still had no idea about how most of it worked without destroying Saki's chakra system. He had gone to the shinobi library after asking the Hokage about seals and being pointed in that direction, though the books that he could borrow as a non-ninja were of minimal help beyond teaching him the rules of sealing, something Kage hadn't known about at all. Speaking of Kage, he had received a letter from the man through the courier service that ran through the elemental nations. He thought the girl he had found was actually an Uzumaki, but she was also a grass genin and seemed to be a sensor, as she was able to detect his presence even when he was using his shadow techniques. And according to her, his chakra was too dark for him to be trusted, whatever that meant. She had also obviously informed her superiors, as after the first two attempts at contact, she had been placed under guard. Kage had said he would make one more attempt before returning to Konoha, with the idea of taking Naruto over the Christmas period to grass, in the hope that Naruto might have more luck in talking with her. Whilst not adverse to the idea, Naruto knew that it would be fun to persuade the Hokage to allow them to travel from Konoha with him, having only just returned there. But for now, it was all just hypothetical anyways. Returning to reality, he looked up from his work to look across at Saki, who was lying on the grass near him reading her book, one that she had claimed was of a series that her mother had liked when she was alive. She obviously enjoyed it as well, as when they had finished training for the day, she had asked if he would just sit with her while she read, something he didn't mind as he had been simply going to work on the seal once more anyways, so the location didn't particularly matter. He now had more than a dozen copies of the seal, each of which bar the original was covered in his workings and scribblings. She smiled at something in the book before casting a look at him, locking eyes with him. Neither shifted for a moment, though Saki's smile didn't fade in the slightest. After another moment, she looked away and tried to move past the situation with a question. Naruto-kun, I know you disappeared for 2 years, and that you obviously trained under a teacher in that time. Do you think you would be able to train me in some things? She paused, then rapidly continued before Naruto could say anything, nothing that is specifically related to your clan or anything, but what with my brother out there, I need to get stronger much faster if I am to be able to beat him when the time comes. Over the last week, they had tentatively discussed Saki's brother, and of course, the massacre that he had caused. Saki revealed that she was still receiving counseling once a month from Ino's father on the subject, but it didn't seem to be helping in the slightest. It obviously made her vulnerable to be revealing such a weakness to him, so Naruto did his best to make sure she would not think he might take advantage of it at some point. All of the talking seemed to have helped, though, as she could now discuss her brother in vague terms without suffering from the old flashbacks, though they would still catch her at the most random of times, freezing up at the sound of child laughing or at a pattern of leaves on the ground. Naruto liked to think that he was helping her through it, but with how broken she was after each event, he wondered whether trying to get her to open up was making the situation better or worse. He decided to break her from her memories with some good news. Worst comes to worst, he would have to strong-arm Kage into doing it, but he doubted he would have to get that far. Of course he will be able to teach you some things, especially if you still wish to use a blade. My only warning would be that you would have to tell him. She shook herself for a moment before shrugging. I expected as much, and besides, if when he gets back he continues to train you, then I won't be left out if he is training me as well. Naruto didn't comment, but both understood that to be the real reason that Saki wished to train under Kage, with a number of her adoring fans amongst the shinobi populace, it would not have been too hard for her to get training from them instead, but she would have to do that as Sasuke, a persona she had finally managed to admit that she did not enjoy keeping up, even if it did make things easier around the village. He nodded slowly before collecting his work together. Night was falling, and he still had to get Saki home. Standing, he heard Saki follow suit with a sigh of disappointment. She had long stopped pretending to dislike having to hang around him, though she sometimes continued to complain in jest. Sealing his work away, he turned round as Saki stepped forward, slowly hugging herself to him as he once more activated his shadow teleportation technique, appearing in the entranceway of Saki's renovated house. As Naruto tried to pull away, Saki looked up at him whilst pulling him back into the hug, her silent plea causing him to sigh in fake duress before returning the hug. They stayed like that for a minute before finally she pulled back, smiling at him. Naruto-kun, I have a request to make of you. As she said it, she pulled him further into the house, so it couldn't be too bad, he presumed. Time skipped 2 weeks. That little request had paved the way for Naruto's transition into the Uchiha house for 3 nights every week. Saki had requested that he stay in the guest bedroom, which was next to hers and connected by an in-suit bathroom. The reason had quickly become clear as to why this request had been made. After Naruto had reluctantly agreed and returned to his house for bed gear, the two had stayed up by the fire in the lounge, drinking hot chocolate and talking quietly until Saki had fallen asleep on his shoulder, smile firmly on her face. He had simply sat there for a while, enjoying the presence of someone his own age who was completely comfortable with his presence. Finally, he had shifted himself up and had carried the girl to her bed, tucking her in before returning to his own temporary room. He had been asleep for barely an hour before he heard the screams and cries from next door. Rushing through the inn soot, katana ready, he found Saki in the throes of a nightmare, tossing and turning in her bed, crying out intelligibly to someone. Upon waking her, she realized who he was before throwing herself onto him, crying pitifully. It came out that she got the nightmares every couple of nights, and after them she would not be able to sleep any further that night. She had been hoping that the presence of Naruto nearby would have help, but it didn't seem to have any further effect. As such, they had talked some more, Saki revealing that she hadn't even told Ino's dad anything about the nightmares, thinking that they made her seem even weaker than she already was. Naruto had comforted her for a while longer, and without her realizing it, she had fallen back asleep in his embrace. With no way out of the situation without waking the girl, he had resigned himself to being beaten in the morning by the girl and had fallen to sleep himself. The two had awoken to Saki's alarm clock going off for the academy, neither having stirred in the night at all. This was all Saki had needed to prove to herself that Naruto was a soother of her nightmares, and therefore had asked him to stay with her from now on. Naruto had eventually compromised with every other night, arguing that once they had graduated he might not be available every night and that they had to try and get Saki through it herself. According to Saki, it was having some effect. The nightmares came less frequently, even when he wasn't there, and she was sometimes able to get back to sleep after waking. The other reason that Naruto had argued this was that he knew that Kage would be taking him out of the village during the next year at least once, if not several times, and that he certainly wouldn't let Saki travel with him at first. Not that the Hokage would allow two such high-value targets out of the village unsupervised regardless. Though that would not be for a while, it seemed, judging by the coded information that Kage had put in his latest letter to Naruto, that he had received the day failed to make any progress in regards to the Kusajinin. Kage had turned his attention to rumors of a group of slavers that claimed to be able to give their clients bloodline users of various varieties, one of which sounded like it could belong to the sister clan of Whirlpool. The suitably named Oni clan, who were able to summon and control various small and minor demons to serve them in battle and on missions. With this news, it became clear that Naruto would have to do some original training of his own whilst Kage was occupied, as he had nearly completed all of the exercises that the man had left him when they parted company on the land of Fire Border. That was something that he could ask the Hokage about. He was sure a man of his experience would surely be able to help him with some of the stuff that he was struggling with. But for now, he decided to think about that particular idea later. The academy bell, signaling the end of the day, had just rung, and seeing Sasuke disappear out of his seat and through the door made it clear that Saki wished to start training as soon as possible. The reason for this was probably the day's discussion, which happened to be on the prominent clans in the village, which obviously included a talk about the Uchiha clan. Several of her fans had spent the session cooing to her alter ego about how tragic it was that his family was gone now, something that brought the Uchiha very close to snapping at them for their lack of tact. But he had little to worry about in that regard. Saki would head over to the compound whilst loosing her pursuers and fans, changing into her female form when she was suitably hidden from prying eyes, and then heading over to the training grounds that they had pretty much claimed as their own well away from the village where any non-ninja might come snooping around. So even with her initial lead in the race to the meeting point, it would take her most of an hour to reach the training ground in question, which was more than enough time for her to cool down some before he would be training with her. That was what he hoped anyways. The girl was now as fast as him without using her Sharingan, and as such could do a fair amount of damage to him when pissed. She also felt very little guilt with the damage she did do after having discovered his healing ability, claiming that it was helping his ability get better after all, which was always good. He suspected the reason was actually more because she still wished to make sure that he did not think of her as weak in any way, though he wished she didn't feel the need to break his nose every time that she could in a spar to prove it. With time on his side, he spent 10 minutes observing the rest of his class slowly disappear into the normal Konoha hustle and bustle that was the main village, before taking off to the training ground at a slow, leaping jog across the rooftops, which would allow him to think whilst moving without much risk of running into something by accident and embarrassing himself, as he had seen several Sasuke fans do, as they tried to pursue the boy on his way home. Little did Naruto know that for once it was he that was being followed on his way to the training grounds, his relaxed senses and attitude lowering the sixth sense that Kaguya had tried to sow. Even with her initial lead in the race to the meeting point, it would take her most of an hour to reach the training ground in question, which was more than enough time for her to cool down some before he would be training with her. That was what he hoped anyways. The girl was now as fast as him without using her Sharingan, and as such could do a fair amount of damage to him when pissed. She also felt very little guilt with the damage she did do after having discovered his healing ability, claiming that it was helping his ability get better after all, which was always good. He suspected the reason was actually more because she still wished to make sure that he did not think of her as weak in any way, though he wished she didn't feel the need to break his nose every time that she could in a spar prove it. With time on his side, he spent 10 minutes observing the rest of his class slowly disappear into the normal Konoha hustle and bustle that was the main village, before taking off to the training ground at a slow, leaping jog across the rooftops, which would allow him to think whilst moving without much risk of running into something by accident, and embarrassing himself as he had seen several Sasuke fans do as they tried to pursue the boy on his way home. Little did Naruto know that for once it was he that was being followed on his way to the training grounds, his relaxed senses and attitude lowering the sixth sense that Kaguya had tried to instill in him and making him oblivious of the threat that was stalking him. Chapter 9. Something you should know. Sakura was having a bad week, if not a bad month, if she was honest with herself. Since the arrival of the new kid in school at the start of the year, she had been hoping to work her way into his good books, but his general attitude, as well as what he had done to Kiba, had given her more than enough reason to be a little bit more cautious about her approach than just to walk up to him and see if he remembered her, especially with her accidentally throwing a kunai at him when he had appeared in their class as he had. It was certainly difficult to remember the annoying but cheerful blonde that had fawned over her when they were younger, when she cast her eyes once more round a chimney that she had hidden behind when the black cloak boy she was following looked round almost warily once more before setting off at what he obviously thought was a lazy place. The reason she was following him was a bit selfish if she was being honest with herself. Whilst the academy had started off well for her, scoring highly in the tests and being selected to be part of the top class in their year of the academy, whilst increasing her chances of being placed in a strong genin team when she graduated, she also found that many of her friends from preschool were jealous of her now, not only because of the extra training and special teaching that she got as part of the class, but they also resented her for being able to crow at their meetings that she got to talk and train with the hottest boys of the class, such as Kiba and, of course, Sasuke. Eventually, they slowly began to get meaner to her in their chats, and soon it became clear that she wasn't welcome in their friends group once more. This would have been fine with Sakura. She had known for a long time that children could be fickle over such things if she hadn't already fallen out with her best friend in the class, Ino Yamanaka, over a stupid competition to try and get the Uchiha of all things. So there she was, a year and a half into the academy with the highest female score in the theoretical tests, and all of a sudden friendless and alone whilst at school, and outside school wasn't much better. She hid it well from her family, as they would just worry and put further pressure upon her. This was why she was following her classmate as she was now, primarily to avoid having to go home too early so that she could pretend to her parents that she had been hanging out friends. The other reason was a little more a hopeful wish rather than anything else. She had to admit there was an almost niggling idea that the reason she was following him was that he would catch her doing so. As long as he didn't react too harshly, it would give her the perfect opportunity to talk to him away from everyone else who might try and dissuade him from befriending the nerdy big head, as she had heard some of her former friends refer to her as recently. It certainly would be nice to talk to someone as a close friend again. Leaping off once more to try and keep up with Naruto, she found him leaping off to the northernmost edge of Konoha, far beyond she had been during her life thus far, going to the right-hand side of the Hokage mountain and into the training grounds that made up that area of Konoha. Passing through some of the closer training areas, Sakura found it harder and harder to stay hidden whilst Naruto passed through, and she was almost certain he knew someone was following him by now. But they reached the seeming destination without incident, and Naruto was stood in the large open clearing pacing around and doing some basic exercises while Sakura watched on silently from the sidelines. Normally, she would leave at this point. She had been following people for long enough to know that being caught watching them training was worse than just whilst they were traveling around. But something about the exercises he was doing, the way that they flowed so fluidly from one stance to the next with Naruto seeming to have to make an effort, entranced her in a way that just drew her in. She was about to risk everything, break from where she was hiding and rush out to him, damn the consequences, when she felt someone grab her roughly and pin her right arm up her back. She was about to struggle and try and shout for help when there was the feeling of something cold and sharp placed against her neck, causing her to freeze in place, not even daring to breath. Naruto continued his exercises, oblivious to her plight as she and whoever was holding her stood there in silence for a moment, before she built up the courage to try and speak. "Please, I didn't mean any harm." She cut off with a pained groan as her arm was twisted painfully a little further behind her back, but Naruto's head darted to where they were stood, stiffening before he disappeared in a flicker of speed. Sakura wasn't sure she should be relieved or even more worried as Naruto spoke from behind her and the arm lock lessened slightly. "You know, when I sent you a message about the fact that I was being followed and that we needed to come up with a plan, this wasn't quite what I meant." There was silence other than the figure holding her, shifting slightly before Naruto spoke, this time more insistently. "No, let her go. Don't make me force you off her. We give her a chance to explain herself before anything else. And definitely no kunai to the neck thing on one of my classmates. That is a definite no-no. Even if she did try and throw a kunai, first day back." That brought a blush to Sakura's face even as the figure let go of her hand and removed the kunai whilst pushing her forwards against the tree that she had been hiding behind. She knew that would come up at some point. Turning around, she found herself looking at Naruto and a girl about his height with short black hair and dark eyes, in a short length kimono that seemed to have been made for battle as well as normal wear, if the ease of movement and the silence they had snuck up on them was anything to go by. The girl seemed to be fuming, though was restraining herself from speaking at this point for some reason. Naruto seemed to sense this tension and stepped forwards, smiling politely at Sakura in what he obviously hoped was an easy way to diffuse the situation. "Don't mind her, Sakura. She's an old friend of mine that is really protective of me, and well, with you sneaking around following me, she's a bit jumpy." His smile faded a bit, and he looked at her seriously for a moment before continuing further. "Now, about that. Care to explain what you were doing?" Sakura gulped before bowing her head in what she hoped was perceived in an apologetic and respectful manner. Naruto by himself she could deal with, but it was the protective psycho she was a lot more worried about. "Well, Naruto-san, this is going to sound a bit weird, but please hear me out." Naruto Uzumaki. Looking down at the now dozing girl in front of him, Naruto couldn't help but shake his head in an amused manner at the story he had just been told. As reasons for stalking go, the idea of doing so simply to pass the time in order to fool her family was not something he would have expected ever from the girl he remembered in the old days. There was a rather unladylike grunt from his right, where Saki was stood leaning against a tree, scowl still on her face. "I'm glad you find this whole thing amusing, Naruto-kun, considering it all nearly went to hell because of your chivalry. If you hadn't been so quick off the mark with your bullshit about me being Kage's goddaughter, who has been put in charge of watching you whilst he was gone, I don't dare think of the possibilities. What would have happened if she somehow drew the connection to Sasuke?" Naruto shook his head, even as he stood to stretch out his muscles. "Well, I apologize, Carrie, but that was the best I had at the time, and to be honest, if we get it cleared with the Hokage and Kage, it's a perfect cover for you to use. Nobody would question you walking around then." That removed the scowl off her face, and she thought about it a moment longer before nodding approvingly. "Yes, that may in fact be for the best, and it will stop Sakura-chan here digging any further than she should for the near future. What are you going to do in regards to her anyways?" He decided not to comment on the familiar form of address Saki used despite her seeming dislike for the girl, and instead sent her a questioning look that caused her to shake her head and chuckle. "Don't give me that look, Baka. I know you well enough by now. I could see your heartstrings being plucked as she told her little sob story. He stopped grinning at this and threw a disbelieving look over at her at the implication. Are you just implying to leave her here and pretend this never happened? Would you have wanted me to do that to you when we had our little chat? She flinched, and he regretted bringing it up that way, but her antisocial tendencies was something he needed to start helping her with sooner or later regardless, and this was as good a time as any. When she spoke next, it was much more quietly, and there was almost an uncertain tremble in her tone. This is nothing like that, and you wouldn't, not after all this. He was across the clearing in an instant, wrapping his arms around her tightly as she quivered underneath him. She took several deep breaths and slowly stopped trembling as her head slowly rested on his shoulders. Baka, don't say stuff like that. You know what happens. He grinned. The previously insulting term had become almost affectionate these days, and he had to admit he did enjoy the closeness that they now share with each other. He leaned back slightly to look at her, and she did the same with a small smile of her own. They both just stayed there for a moment, and then just as he thought she was leaning forwards, she looked away to the sleeping Sakura, and the smile changed into something wistful almost. I think you were right. We better get her home soon, otherwise her parents will probably panic and call the ANBU to search for her. He disentangled with a sigh, but nodded and headed over to pick the girl up gently. That's all well and good, but unless you know where she lives, we're going to have to wake her up to get her home. There was silence as he hefted the girl up bridal style, and turning he saw Saki looking away from him, slight blush on her face. Promise not to judge me too much? He nodded even as he worked out what her question meant, and he started to put together the dots in his head, even as he worked out that she wasn't watching him and couldn't see his head movement, and spoke quietly. Of course not, Saki-chan. You know I will never judge you. She looked at him thankfully and then nodded slightly. I know where she lives, and yes, before you ask, my feelings for her are a little more than platonic in nature. He nodded and simply walked up to her and leaned his head against hers, much to her obvious surprise, but it was the only way he could physically relax her with the girl in his arms. He smiled reassuringly at her. Nothing to be ashamed of, Saki. Your heart is your heart after all, and you should never try to... He cut off as she suddenly leaned forward and kissed him square on the lips. Her eyes closed as she seemed to be trying to pour everything she had into the kiss they were sharing, and honestly, Naruto had to admit that he was not at all adverse to the new feeling. After 20 or so seconds they broke away, both flushed and grinning before Naruto looked down worriedly at Sakura and then back to Saki. But Sak, she cut him off by holding a finger to his lips and smiling brightly at him. My heart is my heart, and I chose to listen to it this time. If anything you're concerned about, Sakura, and I just proved that my feelings are suitably placed. She turned away and jumped up to the lowest tree branch before turning her head to grin at him once more. Are you coming, Naruto-kun? And then she was gone into the trees, and Naruto cursed himself out of his daze and hurried to follow, trying his best to ensure that he didn't wake the girl in his arms as he did so, the giant grin on his face never fading at the memory of what had just happened. Previously on the shade of it. But Sak, she cut him off by holding a finger to his lips and smiling brightly at him. My heart is my heart, and I chose to listen to it this time. If anything you're concerned about, Sakura, and I just proved that my feelings are suitably placed. She turned away and jumped up to the lowest tree branch before turning her head to grin at him once more. Are you coming, Naruto-kun? And then she was gone into the trees, and Naruto cursed himself out of his daze and hurried to follow, trying his best to ensure that he didn't wake the girl in his arms as he did so, the giant grin on his face never fading at the memory of what had just happened. Chapter 10, Trips, Trouble, and Torment. Kari-chan, you need to tighten up your stance. It is too loose for this type of combat. Naruto, you need to dodge more than you are currently doing so. Or is it that you like having your face smashed in every time we spar? I thought that was something you only like my goddaughter doing to you. Naruto snorted as he rose from where he had been sent flying back to his feet, wiping a small trail of blood that was trickling out of his mouth before adopting the first stance of the Uzumaki style once more to face his opponent. Saki moving to stand beside him in her own Uchiha stance as Kaguya looked at their bruised and bloodied forms with something of a smile on his scarred face. So are you two going to attack anytime soon, or are you going to try and keep looking cool for the rest of the time? Kaguya had arrived back in Konoha a week after the Sakura incident to find himself with a new relation and student. The Hokage had made him an ally of Konoha on the official books, but they still tried to keep away from the main areas of habitation as much as they could. Kaguya wounded a shinobi on his first visit to Konoha after all, and that wasn't to mention the ones he had injured at the bounty station. Kaguya had been slightly leery of accepting Saki for training when they had first met, prompting the girl to actually beg for his help in a manner that Naruto had never seen her act before, even when she had been requesting his silence about her gender. Kaguya had eased up seeing that and allowed her to join in the training, finding it hilarious that Saki and he were somewhat seeing each other, commenting several times that he had never expected for Naruto to end up going out with a cross-dresser of all things. Once the two of them had finished yelling at him and blushing at each other, he asked for an update of what had happened whilst he was gone in an obvious effort to change the topic of conversation. Naruto quickly summarized the events since his return, doing his best to ignore how Kaguya chuckled at the incident that revealed Saki to him as female, though that soon morphed into a frown when he mentioned Sakura spying on him and why the girl had been doing it. Naruto skipped over it as best he could. It had been solved the next day after all, but it ended up causing him a bigger problem that he had barely managed to solve before Kaguya had returned. Flashback. He had managed to get the sleeping Sakura home without incident, but that didn't stop her older sister from giving a few teasing jabs at him as he followed her up the stairs to Sakura's room. It seemed that Sakura was telling the truth about her family not knowing about her problems, seeing as her sister, Rukia, didn't stop asking about what her and her friends had been doing to cause her to fall asleep due to tiredness. Naruto dodged that little pothole by claiming he had merely been training nearby when he had come across Sakura sleeping behind a tree, so he assumed they might have been playing hide and seek or something similar. She had thankfully not commented further on that, and had instead taken him to Sakura's room, which was both the same and different from what he had been expecting when he had imagined it in his head. The walls were sky blue rather than pink, as he had rather stereotypically thought, and her room was a bit of a mess, with fluffy toys a little strewn all over the floor and half-drawn pictures scattered somewhat haphazardly across her desk. Her bed was a rather simple one, and he had laid her on it just in time for the front door to open and Sakura's mother to announce her return to the house. Rukia had seemed to understand his unwillingness to meet her mother and had let him escape out of the window in Sakura's room before heading to the entrance of Sakura's room, shouting something inaudible to her mother in reply. The next day, he was up earlier than normal, the night having been one he spent at his flat rather than the Uchiha compound, mainly to give him some time to come to terms with what was happening between him and Saki. He showered and changed quickly before heading out to Sakura's house with a specific purpose in mind. Sakura was very predictable at the academy. Now that he thought about it some more, she always arrived at roughly the same time, sat in the same place, and always ate the same lunch which she brought with her each day. This meant that if he was right, she would be leaving her house right about now. True to his predictions, he saw the pink-haired girl leave the house with school bag over her shoulder, saying something inaudible to those inside as she did so. He let Sakura get about 50 yards before he dropped down beside her, causing her to jump before realizing who it was and blushing embarrassedly at him as she bowed her head to him, speaking quietly so that she couldn't be heard by others in the street that might be listening. Uzumaki-san, I am so sorry for yesterday. I shouldn't have followed you in such a creepy fashion. And then I fell asleep on you as well. He placed a hand on her shoulder, wincing slightly as she stiffened under his grasp, going silent and bowing her head once more. Sakura, it is fine, I swear. I know how you feel, and that is why I am here today. She flinched when he mentioned knowing how she felt and realized she obviously thought it had been somewhat her fault that had been the case before he had left with Kaguya. He pressed on before she could get any more upset, knowing that his offer would hopefully counteract that soon enough. Sakura, I am here to offer my friendship to you, and so that we can start anew without the past weighing upon our actions. What do you say?" He was surprised when she didn't accept straight away, instead turning her head towards him and shaking it worriedly. "But Uzumaki-san, if we were friends at the academy, I would just drag you down socially. It's not like the popular kids want to hang out with the—" Her voice dropped to a mumble at this point, and Naruto failed to catch what she said exactly. But the idea was clear enough to him. His hand shifted from her shoulder to round her waist in a smooth movement that made her both blush and squeak slightly before she calmed down once more and settled for looking down demurely, her face still tinged pink from her embarrassment. "Sakura-chan, let's think about what we want, not what the stupid idiots that gossip all the time want instead, okay?" She nodded weakly, blushing at his return to the familiar suffix at the end of her name, and Naruto beamed at her, glad to see that he had gotten through to the Sakura he remembered once more. Flashback end. Looking back upon it, now Naruto realized that might not have been the best move considering that was the first sight that Saki saw of him that day, with a blushing girl on his arm and a content smile on his face. She had been rather cold to him for the next 3 days, not turning up to training and ignoring his calls at her house to find out what was wrong. It had only been when he had managed to catch her training as Sasuke in the Uchiha training ground on the 4th day, after he had officially befriended Sakura, that it had become clear how much he had messed up. In a fit of fury, she broke both his nose and 2 of his ribs in the preceding fight before shouting at him at how much she hated him and storming off, leaving him even more confused about the situation from where he was lying in the middle of the training grounds. Never one to give up over something as small as broken ribs, Naruto had doggedly pursued her whilst creating a shade to go and fetch him some things for him to start covering his apology attempt. Saki hadn't gone all that far, hiding in the woods as she cried quietly, something that broke Naruto's heart even as he wrapped her in a hug that she unresistingly allowed herself to be pulled into. They hadn't talked about it straight away, simply eating the dango that his shade had brought for him as the beginning of his peace offering. It was only once they had finished, leaning against each other to keep warm in the cool autumn evening, that Saki asked very hesitantly whether he regretted the kiss at all. It had been at that moment that he actually had a moment of brilliance that was far beyond his usual level of intelligence, leaning in and kissing her once more rather than trying to compose how he fell into words. He had no doubt that an attempt at such eloquence would probably have ended up getting him in even more trouble with Saki. After a few minutes of soft kissing, with only breaks being to get their breathe back, Naruto had pulled back, looking Saki straight in the eyes as he firmly stated that he hadn't regretted the kiss for one moment. Saki had refused to let go of him for the rest of the evening, even once he clarified several times rather firmly that he wasn't going to ignore her now, that Sakura was his friend. This was something she obviously was rather worried about considering that she kept asking about it, the last time she did so being as they were tucking in for bed at the Uchiha compound. He hadn't tried to resist his sleeping location choice being made for him as Saki had started to drag him in that direction. Some battles were just not worth fighting. It had taken until he introduced her to Kage and gotten the man to agree to train her before Saki stopped being so clingy and returned to normal. Saki was obviously appeased that he wasn't going to throw her aside for whatever reason she had conjured in her head, considering that he had done as she had asked and introduced her to Kage. This was even with the embarrassment she obviously felt at having to prostrate herself before the man and beg for his help before he finally agreed. Though Kage's statement that they would be going on a trip a month after he returned had very nearly set Saki off again, especially when Kage informed her very firmly that she could not accompany them. Naruto imagined that old man Sarutobi had been hard enough to get to acquiesce to Naruto going along with Kage, without trying to take the last Uchiha as well, especially considering that they were heading out of Fire Country on the trip. Saki had tried everything, from begging the man and then the Hokage to trying to bribe Naruto to smuggle her out with him when he went. Thankfully, Kage had stepped in and talked with her about it instead of leaving it to Naruto to sort out, as he would probably have caved into her eventually if she had kept asking him, and he knew that would not end well for either of them. Eventually, she backed down, on the 2 conditions that firstly Naruto spend every night with her until he left, which had caused raised eyebrows from both of the older ninja, followed by a rather awkward birds and the bees chat from Sarutobi that had left Naruto red in the face every time Saki hugged or kissed him for the next few days. Her other condition was to make the alias of Kari Nabinaga official in Konoha, so that she could travel the village without the pressures of the Uchiha clan present everywhere she went. This was something that Sarutobi agreed to when he heard about what had happened with Sakura and Naruto's worry that Sakura might start to grow suspicious if she did decide to look into the girl and found there were no records of her. Speaking of the pink-haired girl, she now hung around with Naruto before and during school, doing her best to not act the same as she had before he had left with Kage, though he knew it still affected her actions at times. The rest of the class had been very leery about the bond between the two of them, and several of the more popular girls had tried to break it by trying to convince Naruto that Sakura was not worth his time and that he should hang out with them instead. Naruto had dismissed them calmly and coolly, stating that he had no time for girls who only wanted to befriend him because someone else already had done so. This had caused Sakura to tear up and hug him tightly, promising that she would never let him regret his choice. She had taken to helping him with the homework that the academy had set for the day, and he was hugely surprised at how much knowledge the girl had inside her head, able to remember obscure facts and figures that he definitely could not remember being brought up in class at any point. With both Sakura's and Saki's help, his work began to pick up, moving from C's to low-grade B's in the few short weeks. He had tried repeatedly to convince Sakura that she didn't need to help him with his schoolwork because he was her friend. But Sakura had merely shrugged and stated that she liked spending time with him, and if helping him was a way to hang out with him more, then she didn't mind doing so. With that, and Kage beating several new stances and techniques into him during the torture that he pretended was training, Naruto was feeling confident that even with the time he would be spending away from Konoha, he would do more than well enough in the field trip that would take place after the Christmas break. He broke out of his thoughts to focus back on the training session at hand. With a look to Saki, who nodded her readiness, Naruto charged forwards once more, trying to surprise Kage by summoning two shades to the man's left to support him as Saki fell into position on his right. They would bring the man down this time. He was sure of it. Time skip. They failed awfully, the older man not even reacting to the increase in the number of his opponents. Kage was obviously holding himself back enough to still be able to let them practice fighting against him rather than going all out and crushing them without them learning anything about the fight. It didn't mean he was gentle with them, Naruto thought, as he gingerly felt the bandages on his chest, wincing at the pain the movement forced on his bruised ribs. He was stood by the main gate with Kage, about to go on their month-long trip. The trip had two purposes. Firstly, the pair were visit grass once more for the censor girl. This was to see whether Naruto had any better luck with talking with her about her heritage than Kage did. The second part was to crash the slave auction at which the Oni girl was to be sold at. Of course, they hadn't mentioned that little bit to Sarutobi when getting his permission to leave. It wasn't going to be anything more than an easy hostage rescue mission, so there wasn't all that much that he needed to be concerned about anyways. Ignoring the chill that ran down his spine as he thought that final thought, he instead focused on the crying Sakura in front of him, a matter he knew would require his whole attention sooner rather than later anyways. Sakura-chan, I'm not going to be gone more than a couple of weeks, okay? So, it isn't even going to be the whole school break. I will be back before you notice I am truly gone. Somehow that didn't help things, and she hugged him fiercely to her as she continued to cry into his shoulder, muffling her words, but he could still make them out. That's what I thought last time, and you were gone for 2 years. Promise me you will be back before the end of next week, Naruto, please. Sighing in defeat, he put one arm around her as he spoke in a dutiful tone. I promise I will be back by the end of next Friday. Otherwise, Sakura-chan may have an entire day with which she can get me to do anything she wishes me to do, as long as it is legal in the eyes of the law. Surprisingly, this was the second time today that he was making this particular promise. Saki had extracted the same promise from him, but 2 hours beforehand. This had been when she had said goodbye privately at the Uchiha compound. Seeing as Saki couldn't come, and see him off in person without people wondering who she was just yet. The effect of the promise was exactly the same with both girls, however, the tears slowly drying up before Sakura looked up at him with a hopeful expression on her face. "Do you really mean that?" Like with Saki, Naruto couldn't help but wonder whether she meant the promise of his return or the promise of a day of him doing what she wanted if he didn't. Not that it really mattered either way, as he meant the first promise, so wouldn't need to worry about the second one. "Of course I do, Sakura-chan. As I said, I'll be back before you know." Any further words were cut off when Sakura leaned up mid-sentence and kissed him on the cheek, part of her lips meeting with his own in a weird semi-kiss that left him stuttering as Sakura blushed bright red at what she had done and ran off before he could react to the kiss in any fashion. He broke out of his confused thoughts when Kage chuckled behind him, the older man grabbing his shoulder and turning him so they could shadow walk to the first waypoint that Kage had picked out on the way to grass country. As Kage began to work through the sequence of seals for the technique, Naruto turned his head back to the inside of Konoha, hoping that Saki hadn't been watching Sakura kiss him, otherwise it would end badly for both of them. Persona change, Sakura Haruno. Leaning against the wall of the side alley that she had rushed to after her stupid actions with Naruto at the gate, Sakura couldn't be any more mortified at what she had just done. Admittedly, over the last 3 weeks, her feelings for the blonde-haired boy had quickly grown into something of a crush. His confidence and willingness to be friends with her despite the actions of the other members of the class being large contributions to the feelings that were even now warring in her stomach. And now she had probably gone and ruined all of that by kissing him. When he got back, he would probably work to create some distance between them. She knew that whilst he had been fine with being her friend again despite her past with him, there was no way he would accept a relationship with her in case she started acting like she had done when they had first met. Naruto had been set on her from the first day he had met her, and though they were in different classes, he had always come and hung out with her and her friends. She honestly admitted that she loved the fact that an older boy was fixated on her, and she knew that she had started to take advantage of it, getting him to do things for her and her friends that she couldn't be bothered to do herself. The first time he had truly annoyed her with his doting had been after her first rejection by Sasuke, and in a fit of anger, she had leveled him with a right-handed swing. Though she felt a lot better after the punch, she guessed that this would be the last time she saw him. It wasn't like many people saw violence an attractive trait after all. True enough, that would be the last time she saw him for 2 years, and with the slow loss of her friend group, that had been the incident that Sakura looked back on with the most self-loathing, thinking that she had been the one that had made him leave without even saying goodbye to her. Even when he had finally returned and was placed in her class, he avoided her other than in that class when she attacked him with a kunai of all things. Suddenly, there was a cold and familiar voice from behind her that broke through her depressive musing, making Sakura jump and turn round quickly. Looking up only caused her to pale even further when she found herself face to face with Carrie, the girl that Naruto had introduced as his teacher's goddaughter and a very scary girl in general. "You do realize that was my boyfriend that you just kissed, don't you, Sakura-chan? Perhaps there is something you wish to tell me about you and him?" The cold glare definitely didn't help Sakura's nerves as she hurriedly bowed her head, hoping that a sincere apology would stave off the inevitable beating that the other girl would eventually give her for her unknowing indiscretion. "Kari-sama, I am so sorry. I didn't realize that Naruto-kun was taken. I meant no dishonor on either you or him, I swear." She kept her head bowed, hoping that if the girl did decide to attack her, it would not be on her face or neck. Any other injuries would be easy to hide from her family, who she really did not want to know about her actions today. She saw Carrie's feet approach her and couldn't help shutting her eyes tightly as she came to a stop directly in front of her. Then a small but calloused hand gently touched her cheek and pulled her up so that she was standing up straight, Sakura not resisting in case that angered the girl further. This time when Carrie spoke, her tone was softer and kinder. "Sakura-chan, open your eyes, please. I won't hit you for an honest mistake on your part. I am angry that it happened, but I am prepared to let it go this time." Opening her eyes slowly, she saw that the glare had faded to be replaced with a small frown, Carrie's hand staying lightly gripping Sakura's chin as Carrie stared deep in her eyes for several moments longer before sighing and releasing her, hand returning to the girl's hip. Sakura-chan, how long have you liked Naruto-kun that way then? For what he told me of you before he went training, there was no real sign of your liking of him then. Sakura gulped deeply as she realized that there was no way she was getting out of this conversation without confessing the truth one way or the other. Building up her courage as best she could, she spoke quickly in an attempt to get out of the way. I suppose I should start from the beginning, Carrie-sama. It started the day I met you. This was definitely going to be the most awkward conversation in her life, including the one when Rukia decided to explain the birds and the bees to her in rather exquisite detail. Time skip. Persona, Naruto Uzumaki. Cursing his own stupid confident statement that nothing could go wrong at the start of the trip, Naruto tensed slightly as another of the missing nin jumped through the tree branches below him, obviously looking for him and the girl on his back. The trip to the land of grass had been uneventful, Kaguya quickly determining that the censor girl was still too well guarded to risk Naruto trying to talk to her. So after 2 days of probing the edge of the village patrols, he had led Naruto to the north of grass, where they had done a few days training instead. They were focusing on Naruto's speed and endurance, in preparation for the rescue, as Naruto had termed it inside his own head. That had turned out to be a good thing to do. For once they arrived at the town, the slave auction was taking place, and Kaguya had sensed several fairly powerful missing ninja, as well as those that were meant to be being sold, obviously hired to deter anyone trying to take one of the slaves by force like they had planned to. Kaguya had therefore decided on a two-pronged attack, with him attacking to occupy the ninja present, whilst Naruto snuck in to free the girl. She hadn't been too hard to find with Kaguya's description. She stuck out from the other slaves due to the fact she was in her own separate cell and heavily manacled with chakra-absorbing chains. She was probably a couple of years older than him, though she was obviously underfed and weak from her captivity. He wished there was time to rescue the other slaves, but the moment he opened the door to the Oni cell, an alarm went off loudly elsewhere in the building. This left him cursing as he wrenched the chains out of their wall sockets and hoisting the somewhat unresponsive girl over his shoulder and started his sequence of seals, finishing them as the shades he had put on guard started fighting someone around the corner. The two of them slipped away through his transportation jutsu to the prearranged meeting point that Kaguya had agreed with him earlier on the outskirts of the town as the first of the missing nin rounded the corner. However, Kaguya hadn't showed up before Naruto sensed other presences approaching his location at speed. Assuming that the missing nin had a censor ninja with them to be able to find him, so quickly Naruto hurriedly created 3 shades to act as decoys. As they jumped off in various directions, Naruto leapt up into the trees, settling himself in the highest branches before wrapping his arms and chest in the chakra-absorbing chains that the girl still had attached to her wrists, hoping that it was his chakra that they were trying to follow. The chains immediately lowered his chakra output massively, but also messed up his already bad chakra control to the point that he would be lucky to pull off a replacement jutsu, let alone any other jutsu of his repertoire, without messing it up badly and drawing all the ninja in the area straight to him. Luckily, the chains seemed to do the trick, meaning that the ninja ended up following his shades whilst he stealthily made his way out of the area, though he knew with the reappearance of the missing ninja in the area, it would not take long for them to find him, reduced chakra or not. So he had 2 choices, which were to either continue to try and sneak out of the area, or to teleport sufficiently far away that the censor could not work out where he had gone and follow him. Either option would mean that he would have to leave without Kaguya, but he was sure the man could look out for himself just fine, and at worst they would meet back in Konoha. After a few more moments, thought Naruto decided that teleporting away was certainly the less risky option, as long as he could be sure that there was enough time to perform the hand seals at least. The question was, where should he go to? It wasn't possible for him to teleport straight back to Konoha from here. His thoughts were cut off when the girl in his arms awoke with a cry, ruining any chance he had of a quiet escape. With a flourish, Naruto disentangled his arms from the chains, forming the seals for the shade technique, even as he spun to remove the chain from his chest. 10 shades appeared around him and immediately moved into defensive positions around him. Before he could complete the teleportation, though, he would need to calm the girl down first lest she panic and try and run or something similarly stupid. Leaning over her, he barely resisted the urge to growl angrily as she froze up and looked up at him in a terrified manner. "Sure, my name's Naruto Uzumaki, and I am in the middle of rescuing you, okay? I just need you to grab onto me and not let go, okay?" Her eyes lit up at his surname, and she nodded weakly before grabbing his jacket as firmly as she could with both hands. Beginning the hand seals, Naruto realized he still hadn't decided on a location to teleport to. The image of their safe house near the grass village sprang to mind unbidden, and with no other ideas, Naruto focused on that even as the first of the missing ninja engaged his shades. Luckily, they seemed to focus on the attacking shades rather him, so that as the last shade fell, Naruto finished the last hand sign, and the two of them disappeared from the forest, leaving the three missing ninja standing in the suddenly empty clearing. Persona: Karen, Genin of the Grass Village. It had been a rather difficult couple of months, if Karen wanted to be entirely honest with herself. She was barely 6 months into being a Genin of the Grass Village, and she had already been interrogated and then impounded in the village due to the actions of the missing ninja Nabinaga Kage. The old man had first approached her while she was on an escort mission outside the village to one of the other cities in Grass Country. And after incapacitating her teammates and her Jounin sensei Kage had tried to sit down and talk with her about something of all things. Luckily for Karen, Kage had no time to do whatever he had planned as a squad of Kusa and BU happened to be in the area. They had swooped into combat with Kage and made him withdraw from the area after the pair of them exchanged only a few words. Though two of the ANBU had needed to be healed by her bloodline after Nabinaga had meticulously taken them apart. After the ANBU had returned, they had called for reinforcements to take the mission on in Karen's team's place, a whole squad of Chunin taking the Genin's place. The team were rushed back to Kusa, where Karen was put under constant watch as her team continued to complete D-rank missions. There had been 2 more attempts by Kage to get to her in the following week, but the ANBU dissuaded him before he even got into sight of Karen. The man only retreated to the outskirts of Grass, where he seemed to have a hiding place he liked. She supposed it was curiosity as to what such a powerful and dangerous missing ninja could want with her that stopped her from informing the ANBU where he was hiding, just on the edge of her sensor range when she truly concentrated. She kept watching him, only to be disappointed when he left the next day and did not return that night, or the next night, or the night after. Despite the words she had said at the initial meeting about his chakra being so dark, she found herself exerting herself more and more every day to feel for it. Kage had very expressive chakra, to her at least, and it hadn't fluctuated even after she had made it clear she could sense it. There had been no malice or other dark, tumultuous feelings that disrupted his chakra, even in the combats he was involved in, which wasn't something she could say about some of her watchers as the weeks went by without further incident. Karen liked to think of herself as intelligent, and she could work out why there was as much suspicion and distrust behind her guard detail as there was genuine loyalty. They obviously thought that Kage was either trying to or had succeeded in subverting Karen to spy for him on Grass. It just went to show how little the idiots knew of her true allegiance to Orochimaru before joining their village. Because of the increased guards, she had been unable to meet with her handler that would pass on her information to Orochimaru. With the arrival of Kage and his actions having been the talk of Kusa for a month or so after it happened, Karen had no doubt that Orochimaru was aware of what had occurred, and on a small level that worried her more than she would like to admit. When she had been younger, Karen had been fascinated by Orochimaru and his chakra, which had been different and was still different to any chakra she had ever encountered. But she knew the man was callous and paranoid to the extreme, hardly surprising considering his missing ninja status and very high bounty. And if he suspected Karen was now working for Kage, Then he would ensure that she did not live out the year. But there had been nothing out of the ordinary, even after the guards had been withdrawn and Karen started to think that she was in the clear. Even when she had tentatively met with her handler, one of the village's chunin by the name of Fei Eyes, he had merely asked for a full report about the time she had been under guard, as well as the interaction with Kage. It was the lack of reaction that worried Karen the most, some shadowing of her by her handler, or another of Orochimaru's spies in the village at the very least, but there was absolutely nothing that she could detect with her sensor ability. Just when everything was returning to some semblance of normalcy, she felt Kage on the edge of her senses once more at his usual hideout area. The desire to see if he was here for her was overpowering, and therefore Karen had started slowly walking towards the edge of the village that Kage was based. It was then Karen felt the warmest chakra she had ever come across follow behind Kage. It was like a fresh, warm summer breeze to her senses, her heart increasing its pace, and she very nearly stumbled. Karen barely managed to return to her apartment and claimed illness for the next couple of days so that she could simply enjoy more and more of the mysterious chakra. When the two of them left on the third day, after checking the edges of the Kusa patrol regions, it took every fiber of her self-control to stop herself from chasing after them. For the next week, everything seemed so pale and uninteresting to her, and she went through the motions as if in a daze. Karen was sure her team had noticed, but they didn't bring it up. It didn't mean she was better. She would sometimes get completely lost in remembering the feeling, focusing on the image just like she was now. Reaching out to where she imagined the chakra would be, she nearly dropped her frying pan in which she had been preparing dinner when it was there. It was so much weaker than she remembered it, though, even in comparison to the almost non-existent signature that was next to it. There was no choice in Karen's mind, even as she rushed to the door of her apartment. There was no sign of Kage's chakra, and with the weakness of the second signature, Karen could easily justify to herself that she was going out there to save them rather than to meet the owner of the warm chakra. It did not take more than 20 minutes for her to pass through the gates of the village and into the grasslands that gave the village its namesake. The hiding place would have been impossible for her to find if it wasn't for her ability to sense chakra so well, though the entrance was impossible for her to find. Suddenly, there was a rustling through the bushes behind her, and she barely had time to turn around, unable to sense anything in that direction. There was a short, muscled man with yellow irises that reminded her eerily of Orochimaru-sama. Thought there might be truth to the rumors you were now with the shade of Yuzu. With your sensor abilities, someone like me must come as a surprise. This isn't personal, of course, but you should have known this was coming when you betrayed Orochimaru-sama. Now more than ever, Karen could only hope that Kage's interest in her had been passed on to whoever his associate was, or she was going to be his shortest-lived informant in history. Persona Naruto Uzumaki. It had been a very difficult jutsu to perform, even more than he had thought it would be, and as such he had come to rather slowly from the unconscious state he had fallen into upon arrival. The chakra-draining cuffs had made the jutsu that much harder to maintain than normal, and traveling such a great distance meant that he was more than a little out of it after reaching the hideout. Naruto was vaguely aware of the Oni girl's weak breathing next to him, and with her weak condition, he managed to force himself to move the girl to the bed area of the hideout. The hideout was an underground set of rooms that were hidden using a set of entrances that utilized no chakra in their camouflaging. This was done deliberately, given that the girl he was meant to have met was a censor. Naruto froze as the sounds of movement above him became clear over the hideout. Could someone have sensed his arrival and come to investigate? Stepping towards the nearest entrance, he pressed himself against the entrance door to listen to what was going outside. The worst situation was that it was a squad of ANBU who had sensed his arrival, and in that case, he would have to give himself up to stop them harming the Oni girl. It's not like he would be in too much trouble. He had no village association they could pin him with, and though they might hold him for a couple of weeks, he didn't have to hide what he had been doing. He could catch a conversation occurring outside the hideaway, which was hardly in line with a group of hardened killers, though the name mentioned caused him to freeze in place. Isn't personal, of course, but you should have known this was coming when you betrayed Orochimaru-sama. There was a very feminine gasp almost next to the hideout entrance he was waiting at, and Naruto realized that if he did nothing, he was about to witness an Orochimaru-ordered execution. Drawing a kunai, he shoved his shoulder against the hideaway entrance, sending himself flying out. Sighting the man he had obviously heard speaking before advancing on a red-haired young woman wearing a kusa headband round her right arm with a long-bladed kunai in hand, Naruto drew his blade as he adjusted his run to engage him. The man reacted in time to block Naruto's strike, a small smirk appearing on his face as he forced Naruto back with a grunt. "So this is the lapdog that Nobunaga has protecting you, Karen-san? My master told me to withdraw if I encountered anyone other than you. Consider yourself lucky this time." Before Naruto could go to strike at him again, he leapt back into the grass, his footsteps rapidly moving away from their position. Getting over the small adrenaline rush the small encounter had given him, Naruto sheathed his blade in time to remember the name that the man had spoken. Karen was the girl Kaguya had been talking about him meeting in grass, right? He turned at the sound of movement, only for the girl to be stood there holding a kunai in a shaky hand near his throat. He sighed even as she glared at him. This seemed to be a bad habit of his being attacked by women he didn't know, at any rate. He went to hold his hands up diplomatically, only for her to twitch dangerously close to his neck as she squeaked out a warning. "You don't move, understand?" Her tone showed that she was more scared of him than he was of her and was overcompensating with bravado. There was a groan from the hideout entrance, where the Oni girl seemed to have woken and slowly moved towards the door, where she was now leaning weakly as she looked at the two of them in a very confused manner. Yes, this definitely was not Naruto's day in the slightest. Persona Karin. Karen whirled round in a pivot at the sound of someone else behind her. With the whirlwind of chakra the blonde boy was releasing to her sensor abilities, it was hardly surprising that the weak signature of the girl with him had slipped her notice. But after the scare with Orochimaru's minion, Karen didn't want to take any chances. Her spin took her around the blonde boy, so that she was holding him in a more classic pacification stance, and seeing him not react hostilely, she decided to try and keep control of the situation that had developed. "Go inside, girl, and don't try anything stupid or your friend gets hurt, understand?" The girl just looked even more confused at her demand, but before Karen could repeat herself, her erstwhile captive spoke up quietly. "Listen, you are of the Oni clan, right? We are well away from the slavers here, so you will be safe here. Karen, and I need to talk things through, and I would much prefer to do that inside rather than out here." The girl stiffened up, and a small look of fear crossed her face at the mention of the word slavers, and looking closer at her, Karen noticed her arms were clad in chains that were visibly draining her chakra. What was she getting mixed up in with this pair? Luckily, the girl seemed to listen to the boy and walked unsteadily back into the hideout, leaving the pair of them alone once more. Kunai still held firmly against the boy's throat, Karen gently jerked him forwards with the other hand. "Walk slowly inside, and then we can talk, but with this talk of slavers, there had better be a very good explanation." He nodded very slightly, obviously buying her bluff, before taking a small step forwards with his left foot. His chakra was still oozing into the air around him, and the effect was like nothing Karen had ever encountered before. It made her feel so warm and happy that it was taking everything she had not to drop the kunai and hug him to her like a plush toy. But caution was prevailing at the moment, and until she was satisfied with the story, she would be happy to keep it like that. The transition inside was slow but remarkably smooth, the boy leading her down the corridor, stopping briefly to shut the entrance to the hideout. The place was very bare, obviously made with the only intent being its function to hide in. The room, he ended up leading her to a prime example. 2 futons were spread on the dirt floor, on one of which the girl was sat, nibbling at some dried fruit that she had appropriated from somewhere. Realizing the boy had stopped and seemed to be unsure of what to do next, Karen went to put her hand on his shoulder to push him further into the room. In a flash, the boy had pushed away the hand holding the kunai to his throat and spun round, sweeping her feet out from underneath her. She hit the floor with a soft thud, the shock fading in time for the boy to knock the kunai from her hand with one foot as he drew his sword and held it near her face. He spoke once more, his tone serious as he looked down at her. Now, to be clear, if I wished you ill for whatever reason, I could do it now, and there would be nothing you could do to stop me. Karen nodded, uncertain of whether she should respond to the statement. It seemed to have been the right thing to do as he sighed slightly and relaxed, moving his blade to his shoulder. A small smile crossed his face as he spoke once more, extending his free hand to her in an obvious gesture to help her to her feet. Well, now that we have sorted out that mild misunderstanding, I suppose introductions are due before I start explaining everything. He turned his head so that he was looking at the other girl, even as Karen accepted his hand with both of her own, chakra not fluctuating in the slightest as she pulled herself up, showing that he trusted her not to try something once more. Trusting not only her instincts, which had led her out here in the first place, but also in her sensor abilities, which had yet to fail her on this front, Karen settled for standing beside the chakra juggernaut who had rescued her, taking in as much of the warm feeling of his chakra as she could. Such was her distraction, she only just made out as he started speaking once more. I will go first as I brought us all here. I am Naruto Uzumaki, last of the Uzumakis of Whirlpool Village. I rescued you both not only because it was the right thing to do, but also because I think you might also be survivors of that village too. Karen was brought back to focus with these words. To be told she could be a member of the rather legendary minor village that had been the greatest casualty of the previous Great War was definitely the last thing she had expected to hear today. It made sense, though, given that Kaguya was a missing ninja of that village. If he thought she was a survivor, then it made sense for him to try to talk to her about it. Whilst it was a rather long shot, it was the only chance she really had left, given that Orochimaru's agents were probably decrying her as a traitor even now. Leaning into Naruto's shoulder, which was just as warm as his chakra was, Karen decided that this last change of loyalties could definitely be the best she had made thus far. Persona Naruto Uzumaki. With the girl who had minutes before been holding a kunai to his throat, now snuggling into his shoulder in the manner that reminded Naruto of some of the alley cats he had befriended on his travels, he turned his focus to the other girl present, who, whilst not aggressive towards him, was still looking at him very suspiciously. How am I to know you are actually an Uzumaki? Kasan had said you had all been wiped out with the fall of Yuzu village. The only reason she survived was that she had been on a mission at the time. It was a good question that he couldn't really answer, primarily because there was no real way that he could prove it. The Uzumaki bloodline wasn't anything flashy that he could show off, and whilst Kage's jutsu were clan jutsu of the Kage clan, until the man himself got here, it could be argued that he had just found a scroll with them in somewhere. He held his hands up helplessly. You make a good point. I cannot truly prove to you that I am an Uzumaki, but my master Nabinaga Kage can vouch for me, and I hope that is enough for you. The girl lit up slightly at the mention of Kage's name, and her suspicious look morphed into a more apologetic smile. Sorry, I realize that I am hardly being gracious considering that you rescued me from my captors and don't seem to be expecting anything as a reward. I am Cho-Lee of the Oni clan, and if you truly are an Uzumaki, I will pledge myself to your service as my clan have done since Yuzu's founding. A small blush rose to Naruto's face as Cho-Lee forced herself into a full reverent bow, which extenuated her rather full bust through her skimpy, ragged clothing. Shaking his head, even as he stored that image away, he freed his arm from Karen's grip and strode forwards, kneeling by Cho-Lee and grasping her shoulder fondly. Never bow to me, Cho-Lee-chan. I'll not have servants or followers when I can have friends and family. Now let's see about those chains you have on, and then we can discuss what you wish to do next now that you have your freedom once more. He looked over to Karen and grinned at her as well. You too, Karen-chan, though I'm sure you can just stay as a grass genin if you wanted to. The offer of choice obviously surprised both of them, but after having so many choices in his life made for him, Naruto refused to do the same for others if he could avoid it. As the three of them sat down to talk, Naruto wondered where Kaguya was at that point and when he would see his old master again. Persona Nabinaga Kaguya. Missing Ninja of Yuzu Village. The rescue could have gone better. There had been more missing ninja than he expected, and whilst he had dealt with 2 or 3 of the more despicable ones permanently, the others had forced him to withdraw faster than he would have liked. Since then, he had been sneaking in to find out news between checking out the meeting point at regular intervals. There was no sign of Naruto, but he expected he would have heard or seen something by now if the boy had been killed or captured. Kaguya had gone out of his way to free several other captives there in order to cover their true objective, though the idea of leaving any of these people to their fates disgusted him. A pair of missing ninja from Yuki passed underneath his hiding spot, talking to each other loudly enough that Kaguya didn't even need to strain his ears to hear them. And then the blonde kid disappears with the ONI girl right in front of my eyes. Friyasama couldn't even sense where he had gone this time. The boss is going to be real mad, and I sure don't want to be the one to tell hi. Ugh. The man was cut off as a kunai came out of nowhere and pierced his chest, even as Kaguya dropped on the other missing ninja and knocked him out with a heavy blow to the head. Seeing as the kunai was not of the make Naruto carried, and he definitely hadn't thrown at Kaguya, was on edge as he extended his senses. Before he could get a true feeling for his opponent, the person in question jumped from the bushes, landing softly half a dozen meters in front of him, arms raised defensively, but not in an offensive manner, even as a soft smile played across their face. Nabinaga Kaguya. I must admit, when I heard rumors of an ONI clan member being in the slavers' pens, I guess you would make an appearance. Now, how do you feel about helping a little girl rescue some more of her friends? With her intent now somewhat obvious, Kaguya relaxed a little as he checked the condition of Yuki Ninja who had been stabbed. He would live with some treatment that Kaguya could give him as the 2 ninja got down to business. How about you first tell me what is in it for me? After all, helping the worst enemy of the Mizukage is something I definitely don't want added to my wanted posters without good reason. Maitirumi. From the saucy grin on the woman's face, even as she moved forwards to help him move the bodies, she would enjoy the negotiating part of this as much as he would. With the Yuki Nin's admission that Naruto had escaped with the ONI girl, Kage knew he could leave getting back to Konoha up to the blonde. He had done it before after all. Earning some allies amongst the missing ninja population was therefore very high up on Kage's list of what to do with his free time. Persona Naruto Uzumaki Sade. So you not only have you stirred things up with the Grass Village by helping one of their most promising genin defect, but you also rescued this girl from a slave ring underguard by more than a dozen missing ninja when you aren't even a qualified genin yet. Anything else you want to tell me before I ban you from leaving the village with Kage ever again? It was almost refreshing to Naruto to be being dressed down by old man Sarutobi once more. After 2 days of travel with just girls, he had to admit that even he was feeling a little drained by it all. Deciding to get the worst of it over with now, he brought up the next topic even as he gripped his sword in a just-in-case fashion. Oh no, there's one other thing, Gigi. Karen-chan here used to work for your old student as a spy. But let's not do anything hasty. Karen-chan has already agreed to give you whatever information she has in return for being able to stay here as a ninja. It had been one of the many things that the 3 of them had discussed once Naruto had revealed his village of origin to the 2 of them. It had taken some work to get Karen to talk about her time serving Orochimaru, both before and after she had also joined the Grass Village. It wasn't the sort of thing that Naruto wished to risk hiding from the Hokage. Best to be honest about it from the outset and let Sarutobi get it all over with in one big swoop. On the other hand, Choli had agreed to return with him until they could make contact with Kage and she could verify what Naruto had told her. Then she was torn between staying and helping Naruto build up funds to set up a true clan compound for them to stay in, or helping Kage search for more of their dispersed clansmen. Looking as Sarutobi's face paled slightly as ANBU quickly surrounded Karen's swords drawn, Naruto decided the discussion about Choli's future could wait for a later time. After a few moments of staring at Karen's terrified face, Sarutobi waved the ANBU off dismissively, his face set in a stern visage as he gestured her to step forwards. You shall explain everything to me now, and then I shall decide what is to happen to you next depending on how truthful I think you are being. If you're an Uzumaki as Kage in Naruto, suspect, then I have no problems accepting you into the village. You will be watched, of course, but that is procedure for any who try to find refuge here from other villages, and I will make sure you are not known for your association to my ex-student. His name still is a tarnish upon this village, even after all these years. And Karen began her story, her voice initially wavering as she got over the fright of the ANBU surrounding her, but growing stronger as she got further into her tale. The shade of Naruto, which had been sent with the two girls, wondered at this point how the real Naruto was doing with Saki, who he was sure would be happy to see him again. Persona: Naruto Uzumaki, apprentice of Kage. Saki, or Carrie as he now supposed she was to be called in public, had been surprisingly relaxed about his return being a little late, though that may have been to do with the company she was keeping as much as anything else. He had eventually found her eating lunch in a small bar near the Uchiha estate, with Sakura, of all people, to keep her company. Carrie had engulfed him in a hug as he landed near their table from his vantage point, but had been her usual aloof self about the whole thing, letting Sakura take the lead with the questioning about his latest adventures. The look in her eyes when he mentioned both Cho-Lee and Karen told him that she was not happy about him hanging out with two girls by himself. He'd refrained from mentioning how clingy Karen had been for the first day until she worked out how uncomfortable he had been with it. Such talk would definitely have left Saki steaming with fury. The two would have to get along, though, as Karen was one of the few whose chakra sensing was strong enough to be able to tell that Carrie and her alter ego Sasuke were one and the same, even with the seal Carrie had on her. With that in mind, he drew himself back into the conversation with a question he knew he might regret later. Carrie-chan, what are you two doing tonight? With Karen and Cho-Lee being new to Konoha, I thought that it would be good for them to meet some new people here so that they don't feel so isolated. Sakura beamed at him and nodded her head eagerly, but Carrie looked a little skeptical before speaking with a thoughtful expression slowly breaking through. But you were just back in the village after being away for so long. How about I come and do the cooking whilst you look after your new guests? Or in other words, Carrie was going to come over so that they could have a proper conversation before anyone else arrived. That's a good idea, Kiri-sama. It will be a proper way to welcome Naruto-kun home. I will be more than happy to help. If you want me to, that is. Sakura's enthusiasm quickly fell from her tone as Carrie leveled a glare at her, and the pinkette bowed her head slightly in deference, making Naruto wonder how much interaction he had missed between the two of them whilst he had been gone. There was a moment of silence before the raven-haired sighed slightly and nodded. Of course you can, Sakura-chan. The more the merrier. The pink-haired girl looked up, her soft smile surfacing once more before the two girls began discussing what they could cook for dinner and where to get the ingredients for the various meals they were thinking of. Sipping the fruit drink that he had just ordered, Naruto simply smiled as the two girls bonded over food, something he could only hope would happen again tonight. It was only at the end of the meal, when Naruto had been about to leave, that Carrie grabbed his arm firmly. The girls moved so that they were sat close to him on either side, Sakura grabbing his other arm with equal grip to ensure he was firmly stuck in place. Carrie spoke first, a serious but playful glint in her eyes. Before you run off, Naruto-kun, when were you planning on telling me about Sakura-chan's little indiscretion on the day you left? Or were you hoping that it would just slip me by? Let's also not forget that today is Saturday, meaning you were a whole day late back. Seeing Sakura nod with similar determination in her eyes, Naruto hastily re-evaluated his previous statement. If this is how much trouble he was going to getting into with two of them, how much trouble would four girls getting along be? Naruto-kun, come on, or we will be late for the start of the field trip. The comment from Sakura, as they jumped from rooftop to rooftop in the direction of the academy, made Naruto regret his promise to the two girls even more than he had when Saki first brought it up. It turned out that the three younger girls got along surprisingly well after some initial difficulties, with Cho-Lee keeping her distance from the others and preferring to spend her time alone or watching over Naruto, claiming that if he was the Uzumaki heir, as he claimed, then it was her duty to protect him when Kaguya was not here. It had been an iffy start, however, between Saki and Karen, which was hardly surprising given Saki's possessiveness and Karen's love of his chakra. The first meeting had taken place that evening, after Karen had been declared a non-threat by Inochi, who had taken a rummage through her mind. It had certainly been an eye-opener. Flashback. Saki had just been finishing the preparation of the udon noodles and sushi, whilst Naruto, Sakura, and Cho-Lee were sitting in a sitting room. The Oni clanswoman was checked out by medic Neens and given a strict no-activity order and a need to come to the hospital every other day for a checkup on her recovery from her captivity. So at the moment, Naruto or one of his shades were waiting on her for everything. Sakura had been obviously uncomfortable with Cho-Lee's rather candid discussion about her past trauma, sold from or fought over by different groups, until the one she had ended up with had found a potential set of owners that she could be auctioned off to. All three girls, as Saki had popped through whilst the noodles were cooking, shuddered heavily at that point, and Naruto gritted his teeth to the point they hurt. How many other girls had suffered the same treatment and not been as lucky as Cho-Lee had been to be rescued? Swearing mentally that he would speak to Kaguya about doing some cleaning work when he returned, Naruto was at least glad to see that the incident had gotten Sakura over her initial discomfort and discussing with Cho-Lee her recovery training. The pink-haired girl having a steely look in her eyes as she offered to be Cho-Lee's sparring partner. As such, it was a rather somber, if relaxed atmosphere that Karen ruined by charging through the front door and throwing herself at Naruto in what was rapidly becoming a normal set of affairs. Naruto-kun. Thank God it is the real you this time. Your clones are all so murky. The men the Hokages sent me to were really scary. The fact that Saki had walked in at this point due to the noise, only to find a red-headed girl who she didn't know rubbing her face into his chest, mumbling unintelligibly whilst doing so. Naruto winced even as Saki's face hardened. He really liked his nose, as it was damn it. Naruto-kun, would you kindly tell me who this harlot is and why I shouldn't remove her from this house with Kanai? The voice was not one he had heard since he had first rekindled his friendship with Sakura, a sign more obvious than even he needed that his reply would need to be thought through very. Too late. Karen's head shot up, and her eyes fixed on Saki for a moment before she snarled back. Who are you calling a harlot in front of Naruto-kun skank? At least I don't look like a lesbian hooker off the streets. Yeah, not only was Naruto doomed, but there was no way his apartment was going to come out of this well, as the two girls glared daggers at each other. Sighing as he knew that the angry looks would probably be directed at him in a minute, Naruto spoke up. Karen-chan, the lesbian hooker that you so rashly applied such a rude and impolite nickname to is my girlfriend Carrie-chan. Carrie-chan, this is Karen-chan, who your godfather thinks is an Uzumaki clansman. She is a very powerful chakra sensor, able to pinpoint a signature from miles away. Supposedly my chakra is very comforting to her, and she has just had a long talk with the Hokage and his T+I people. Now, can both of you apologize and pretend that the last 30 seconds didn't happen? Both girls had obviously gotten his included reason for the two of them to get along, as both stopped glaring at each other, rethinking their position and approach towards the other girl. Karen, whilst obviously not happy that he already had a girlfriend that he had not mentioned to her before now, was intelligent enough to know that if she and Carrie continued to fall out, then Naruto would have to pick sides, and it was almost certain who would win. So she wanted to keep her narrative from being permanently reduced to zero. She would have to play nice with the other girl. Besides, she had seen the appreciative glance that Carrie had given her whilst Naruto had been telling them both off. Mixed with the telltale fluctuations in the girl's chakra, Karen wondered whether she had been closer with her original comment about Carrie than she thought. She would never say it out loud, of course, as that probably would get a fight that she would lose, but that meant the door she had just shut might have opened a little bit once more. Karen only hoped that a sincere apology would be enough given her disadvantageous position in this situation. Saki was in a bit of a quandary herself, not that her red-headed opponent would realize that. The urge to jump across the room and tear the redhead away from her Naruto-kun before giving her the beating of a lifetime was overwhelming. But the information Naruto had reminded her about made her realize that such actions would only be to her detriment in the long term. She cursed herself mentally for forgetting the warning Naruto had given her about the other girl he had rescued. She had let her emotions control her, and now her pride was definitely going to suffer for it. Even as she prepared to lower herself to an apology, Karen shrugged herself away from Naruto and stood up before bowing in her direction. Carrie-san, I apologize for my words. I just tend to let my emotions get ahead of me at times when I'm not prepared for it. I hope we can look past this misunderstanding and become friends. Karen's eyes caught hers from the bow at the word friend, making Saki wonder whether there was more meant by that word than its obvious meaning. Regardless of any missed inflection, the girl had extended the olive branch, and there was no way Saki wasn't going to take advantage of it while she was in this seemingly stronger position. She pulled off a small bow back before speaking, her words obviously a little forced, but there was not much to be done about that. Very well, sorry for my abruptness, Karen-san, but I do not appreciate my boyfriend being smothered without her clearing such things with me first, assuming I would allow it. Come, we will discuss our new friendship in the kitchen whilst I finish dinner. The tense atmosphere dissipated as the two girls headed into the kitchen, and the door was shut, but Naruto was still a little on edge as he waited for the sounds of shouting or fighting. 15 minutes later, the door opened, and the smell of food wafted through without any signs of conflict, though the happy smirk on Karen's face made him slightly nervous as she brought the first bowls of food. She put the plate down before walking over and bowing to Sakura, who seemed almost as nervous as he was feeling at the abrupt change in attitude from both girls. You must be Sakura-chan. I am Karen. We have just been talking about you. Naruto sighed as Sakura went from nervous to terrified as Saki walked through with the rest of the food, placing it down before stealing a kiss of him with a "we will talk later" smirk on her face. He was so totally screwed. In flashback, thus began the most awkward period of Naruto's life to date. Karen and Saki wouldn't tell him what they discussed in the kitchen that night, but given Karen's almost permanent attachment to his arm or chest when she was around and Saki's public lack of reaction, they had obviously worked something out, and it probably was to do with Carrie's real identity. The fact that the four girls ended up getting along so well turned out not to be the best situation for Naruto, especially when Saki had brought up the fact that he owed her and Sakura a full day each of doing whatever they wanted him to do. Admittedly, he thought with a blush it hadn't been all bad for him. Saki's requests had been fairly normal, taking her out for dinner and then back for a sleepover at his apartment with the other girls. He definitely couldn't say he was complaining when they had all settled in for a movie, Saki on his lap, Karen on his left, and Sakura on his right. Shaking his head to clear his head as they landed on the rooftop above the academy entrance with a couple of minutes to spare, Naruto extended his senses upon spotting half a dozen genin stood out in the training area, many of them already looking completely bored with the idea of the field trip they would be leading. His hunch proved to be correct, as when he concentrated, he found several more figures hiding in the surrounding area, obviously having wished to observe the arriving academy students without being observed themselves. His eyes flickered between the three most powerful chakra signatures. He could feel two of the people who were hiding, including a Hyuga clan member who was not so much hiding as merely perching on the academy roof in a manner that exuded arrogance and ability in equal measure. The other powerful signature was actually the only one in view that had looked up at his and Sakura's arrival, a girl in a battle dress and twin hair buns on the top of her head. The girl was twirling a kunai round a finger in a practiced manner, and by how her eyes followed him leaping down from the roof, he could tell she was imagining throwing said blade at him as a theoretical exercise in her head. Her manner was not the same kind of arrogant confidence the Hyuga exhibited, but instead it was a self-assurance that came with battlefield experience and having faced opponents stronger than her and survived. It was for that reason Naruto resisted provoking her as he had originally been intending. The shade he had created that had snuck up behind the assembled genin, understanding his slight shake of the head and dispelling with a soft noise. Ignoring the watching genin, as Sakura called out to him from the academy entrance that he was going to be late, Naruto headed inside. Hoping against hope that the team he was going to be given was going to be a good one. Being given one of the lazy genin as a team leader and a pair of nobodies as team mates would really ruin his day. Time skip. It turns out that there were actually worse people he could have on his team than nobodies. He had forgotten the possibility of getting Fangerless clan heirs as part of his team. Looking over at where Ino Yamanaka was struggling through the forest with a backpack easily twice the size it needed to be for the 2-day trip, no doubt filled with makeup and hair products rather than anything actually useful to their trip, Naruto managed to resist the urge to shake his head disbelievingly. At least this was giving him a chance to practice his trap-making and evasion skills, something that Kaguya had been very insistent that he worked on when the man finally returned to Konoha 2 days beforehand. Where the man had been and what he had been doing, Naruto didn't know, and no amount of nagging the man with questions had drawn anything but a knowing smile and vague statements that were no use whatsoever in attempting to work it out. Kaguya had merely returned, reported to the Hokage, and met Karen and Cho-Lee to prove Naruto's claims before he whisked the Oni clan member off on a training trip, saying they would be back after the field trip. Having experienced Kage's training before, Naruto had felt sorry for the girl, but that hadn't meant he had said anything to her before she left. He wanted her to experience it the same way he had. His internal debate on whether such thoughts made him evil was interrupted by the arrival of the third member of the group, a quiet civilian girl by the name of Umi Kaitoma, who had very quickly appreciated that he knew what he was talking about and could teach her some things. Naruto-senpai, I have finished laying the false trail for this section. Would you like to take a look? Anything from Tenten-senpai. Naruto shook his head, but then indicated that they should head off in the direction of the trail. Tenten had gone scouting ahead for any ambushes that might be waiting for them, leaving him in charge until she got back. Looking over the first 50 yards of the trail Umi had set, Naruto found himself impressed with the speed at which the girl had picked up the advice and techniques he had shown her. It was a good trail, making it look like their group was doing nothing to hide their tracks without leaving so many clues to their passing as to make people suspicious. Nodding his head in appreciation, he then gestured further down the trail. Very good work, Umi-chan. How far does the trail continue for? The girl blushed slightly under the praise before replying, obviously not confident in her ninja abilities, having been the same class as so many prominent and influential clan and family heirs. A few hundred yards, Naruto-senpai. Is that enough? I didn't want to take too long in case you moved on without me. More than enough for just a simple field exercise, but good to get the practice in now rather than when she actually was going to need it. The idea of them moving off far enough to lose her, though, was quite amusing, having been forced to give up on Tenten's original plan of zigzagging across the forest to their second checkpoint due to Ino's slow pace and low endurance. In an effort to speed things up, Naruto had offered to take Ino's backpack, but Tenten had insisted that she needed to carry it herself. The female genin had been very short with Ino when she had been complaining about the pace the group had been setting, making Naruto think that the girl had been forced to deal with similar people during her time at the academy. Whether this was an attempted lesson Tenten was trying to teach the spoiled clan heir, or simply a misguided payback for the Tenen's own experiences with spoiled brats, Naruto was not quite sure. But at some point he was going to have to step in to ensure that Ino would actually be able to finish the 3-day exercise without breaking down entirely. Shaking of the insubordinate thoughts that he knew wouldn't do him much good in Tenten's after-mission report, Naruto smiled at Umi before nodding his head. Very well done, Umi-chan. Come on, let's get back to Ino before she has a panic about being left alone. As the pair of them stepped off towards where they could hear their erstwhile teammate struggling through the brush, making sure to remove any obvious signs of their passage as they went, they weren't to know of the two very different dangers that were waiting for them ahead. Persona. Kaido Suzuki, former Chunin of Konoha. As he paused in leading the bandits for the third time in as many miles to scout ahead and make sure that they weren't following yet another false trail, Kaido placed a hand over his stomach as phantom pains of his wound flared up once more. Kaido's life had gone from being a solid chunin to less than dirt in the eyes of the Konoha military in one night, all because of the demon and its shadowy follower. He had been about to do the entirety of Konoha a favor by finally managing to put an end to the beast, and then the next thing he knew, he was thrown into interrogation and taken before Marino himself. He had been lucky to survive the torture that the mutilated man had furnished on him in an attempt to get him to admit that he had been trying to kill the demon, something that Kaido was clever enough to not admit given the Hokage's deluded like of the boy. He managed to get himself let out a month later due to the friends he had amongst the civilian populace, both due to the fact that Ibiki had been unable to collect any substantial evidence on the charges and the fact that the demon had disappeared after that night with no one being able to work out where or what had happened to it. His ninja career had been finished with that, though, the Hokage personally seeing to his medical discharge due to the wound he had sustained that night. For the next 2 years, he had flitted from job to job with no real enthusiasm. He had enjoyed being a ninja, and nothing he could do would make Konoha let him back into the Corps. Then the demon returned without any warning and took a place in the academy, fueling a deep dark rage in Kaido that far surpassed the former hate he had for the boy demon. Why did they let the thing into the ninja corps training program when they kicked him out? With the hate building into an inferno inside him, the darkest of plans came into his head. If Konoha wouldn't let him be a ninja anymore, there were many other villages that would appreciate his talents if he offered them. Therefore, he had just needed to choose the right time to strike at the beast, and then he could leave before anyone would catch him. The academy field trip not only offered him an opportunity when the beast would be out of Konoha, with only a genin and 2 other academy students to protect him, but also a chance for him to hire in some help in case the demon decided to give up the charade. The bandits had been cheap, and though Kaido doubted they would have much chance against the demon, they would distract it long enough for him to be able to get in the kill shot. The fact the demon's team were laying false trail had worried him initially. Perhaps the demon had realized that Kaido was following him, but after the real tracks showed no signs in altering their pace or direction, he merely deduced that one of the team was practicing their skills, nothing more. Not that it would help them now that Kaido had their bearing. Given their pace, they would catch up with them just after dawn tomorrow, earlier if the team took camp for the night, which would be quite likely given the worsening weather, something that made Kaido want to speed things up even more. The sooner he got out of this damn squall and on the way to the border, the better. At the same time, Persona, Irusen Sarutobi, sat in his office, surrounded by the day's paperwork. Sarutobi was almost relieved when one of his bodyguards indicated that there was a visitor that needed to see him urgently outside the usual schedule. Seeing as he had no pressing business to attend to right away, Sarutobi gave a discreet hand sign for them to let the person in. Admittedly, he was a little surprised at who it was that entered his office. The meteorologists of Konoha were usually a very elusive group who rarely left the building complex that was established for them behind the Hokage monument. For the chief meteorologist himself to be here, a man in his 40s with a bristly mustache and balding hair, actually started a feeling of worry in Hiruzen's stomach. Master Yodo, it has been some time. What brings you to my office today? As the man reached up to mop his brow with a hand cloth, the wind howled outside the window, a bad omen that preceded the man's stammering reply. Hokage-sama, we have a problem, and it is coming this way fast. We need to lock Konoha down by the end of the day, or a lot of people are going to die. Sighing at the terrible premonition and the bad feeling rapidly building in his stomach, Hiruzen reached up to rub his temple in an attempt to stave off the headache that he knew was going to erupt from the conversation that was about to take place. A hurricane, large enough to have Yodo using words like Cuba-like, was currently working its way towards Konoha. It wouldn't come close enough to the village itself to do serious harm to any of the buildings, but it would pass within 10 miles, more than close enough to be a danger to his people. Sarutobi sat back in his chair as he heard the reports from his military commanders about how the village was being prepared. They had about 2 hours before the hurricane made outside travel hazardous, and Sarutobi wanted to activate the seals on the village walls before that happened. The seals were nothing more than a complex tagging system to identify whose chakra had interacted with them whilst active, but it would mean if any infiltrators did try and take advantage of their lockdown, they would be easy enough to find. As his ANBU commander finished speaking about his troop deployments and which buildings were being locked down even now, there was a sudden knock at the door. Given that there were currently ANBU stood guarding it, that could only mean whoever it was had urgent news that he had to hear. With a nod, one of his ANBU moved to open the door, revealing the concerned face of Irika, who, after a quick bow, made his reason for interrupting perfectly clear. Two teams from the Academy field trip haven't reported in at the campsite, and the Chunin who was meant to be at the last checkpoint hasn't reported in. And without wishing ill on his surrogate grandson, Sarutobi knew without the need for any further information that one of the missing teams would be Naruto's. Nothing that boy ever did could go according to plan. Line break. The cave is just up ahead. Naruto's call was barely audible over the howling wind, but given that the others had formed a human chain behind him, it wasn't as if they were really going anywhere else. The weather had steadily worsened after they had finally reached the second checkpoint. The Chunin manning the station looking bored out of his mind. They had, after all, taken almost twice as long as planned, and therefore must have been the last group through. By the time that Tintin considered the weather too hazardous to continue to the campsite, it was too late to turn back, and their map had been reduced to a soggy mess despite their best efforts. Water-resistant meant little in this level of pervading rain. So Naruto's shades had scoured the nearby area and come across what must be an old mine, and given the lack of other options, Tintin had ordered him to lead them to it as fast as possible. Ino's rucksack had been dumped hours ago when the danger of the storm truly became apparent. The blonde heiress currently getting a piggyback ride from one of Naruto's shades after falling and twisting her ankle, so their pace had increased greatly. His shades had also found Sakura's team, whose rather bedraggled Genin leader had clearly not been ready for the change in weather and had been trying to lead the team back to the checkpoint. Given the weather got worse the closer back they got to Konoha, Naruto's shade had managed to persuade them to join up with them instead and head for the cave, something the Academy students seemed happy to do, at least even if the Genin was obviously unimpressed at taking orders from him. As they stepped into the small opening, barely large enough for two people across, Naruto was glad they were out of the rain, though the wind and cold would still be a problem for them in these wet clothes. The fact that wind was blowing through the cave was a good thing, though, as that probably meant that his guess of it being a mine had been right and someone had created a ventilation shaft further down the tunnel. Forcing his way further inside, whilst the others huddled off to one side as best they could, Naruto found that it was another 15 meters into the passage that the cave widened to what was obviously the entrance shaft for the main mine itself. There was a 3-meter wide hole in the floor at the center of the room, and looking over the edge whilst a shade went to inform the others of what he had found, Naruto was very glad he had the sense to bring a lighter with him on the trip. If not for the illumination it had provided, he might well have dropped straight into the pit itself, creating another shade, which was really taxing even his reserves to the limit. Naruto left it to stand guard over the pit, whilst they knew it was there now. Better to be safe than sorry. Opening one of his seal scrolls, of which he had 3 different types and a redundancy of each on his person at all times, Naruto unsealed the tent he owned and had brought for the trip, a nice 3-man tent that would hopefully house most of them at any rate. He had it mostly set up when Tintin's voice made him look up and find her moving Ino towards him whilst Yashido, the other Genin, was moving further into the cave with a small torch sweeping in front of him. Good thinking, Naruto. The sooner we get out of this wind and change our wet clothing, the better. The pair had talked quite a lot about sealing and its uses whilst they had been waiting for Ino, so Tintin knew about some of his inventory that he had available. That was probably the reason for her next question. Have you got any clothes that we can get Yamanaka here into? Given we had to drop her rucksack and Ami needs clothes, I have no other spares. Ami and Sakura on the same team. What had the Academy staff been thinking? It didn't matter too much right now, as the loud-mouthed girl was currently clinging to her sides pitifully as she tried to bring some warmth back in her body, but it would be interesting to see if her attitude changed at all once she warmed up. Putting the last touches to the tent, Naruto nodded and quickly unsealed a plain black t-shirt and matching trousers and handed them across to the blonde heiress. There you go, Ino-san. If you and the other girls use this tent to change for now, whilst we get the others set up, I will go and see how Yashido-san is doing. Or, is there anything else you need, Tintin-senpai? The genin shook her head, and to Naruto's surprise, Ino bowed to him before stuttering. Thanks, Naruto-senpai. Do you have a towel at all? I don't want to wet your tent. Surprising thoughtfulness and humility. But Naruto wasn't going to ruin the moment, so he quickly unsealed a camping towel. There you go, and don't worry about getting the tent wet right now. Get yourself dry and warm. Once this storm has passed, we can worry about drying them out. With that, Ino bowed again, and then quickly headed inside with Ami, who Tintin had given her own clothes and towel. With that done, Naruto left Umi, Sakura, and Shino to set up their remaining tents and headed off in the direction of the diminishing light. Line break. Kairos admitted he had been a little careless. The Chunin they had come across had been a surprise and had managed to kill 3 of his minions before Kaido managed to take him down with a kunai to the throat. But the deaths seemed to have spurred on the other bandits despite the atrocious weather, so there was something of a silver lining to that particular smudge. Of course, the rain and wind made it quite hard to follow the demons' tracks further. But luckily, Kaido knew that they would be seeking hard shelter, and there was only one set of hills in the area that would have that kind of cover. Working out where in that set of hills was a lot more arduous, and Kaido would have missed it if one of the children hadn't flashed a torch out of the cave they were hiding in. Sending the bandit he had taken scouting with him back to get the others, Kaido drew his tanto from that night. Revenge was near, and this time no shadowy demon was going to stop him. Line break. The storm had abated after 40 hours of buffeting winds and a mixture of hail, sleet, and rain. The hurricane leaving a swathe of fire country to the east of Konoha looking like a war zone. The hidden village itself was relatively unharmed though, only some minor damage to buildings and infrastructure due to fallen trees and airborne debris. Such things could be quickly returned to rights. The Sandaime had been quick to try and return things to normal, Izumo thought, which was why he and Kotetsu were back to guarding the gates. The fact that they had seen at least half a dozen search teams head out to try and find the 2 missing academy student teams was something that neither of them particularly wanted to discuss, especially when most of them had already returned without any positive news. Given the fact the last team had returned with a body bag and 2 badly damaged rucksacks, Izumo really wasn't feeling too confident about there being a happy ending. He was surprised, therefore, half an hour later when he suddenly felt a familiar and rather unforgettable chakra approaching the gate. Kotetsu, alert the Yanbiyu, it's Naruto. Kotetsu didn't even blink before he flitted off to the watchtower, leaving Izumo by himself to observe the approaching group. Obviously, the last hunter team had actually found them as they were surrounding the group protectively, who looked like they had suffered far more than just a harsh storm given their array of injuries. 2 of the girls were being carried by members of the hunter team, one with an obviously leg splint and the other with a large amount of bandages covering her upper left leg. The male genin was hobbling along with one arm in a sling, and one of the other students was being carried on a stretcher, but that was nothing compared to Naruto. The blonde-haired boy's face and chest were a mismatch of bandages and bruises, and he was obviously favoring his right side heavily despite the fact he also had a splint on his right leg. The female genin and the pink-haired girl were obviously watching him, but given what he knew of Naruto's bullheadedness, Izumo was unsurprised that he was refusing any help. As the group approached him, Izumo couldn't resist the urge to try and make light of the situation, even as Kotetsu jumped back down and the gates began to open behind him. Bit of a rough night, Naruto-san. The boy ignored him and just carried on walking until he crossed the threshold into Konoha, pausing for a moment before face faulting straight into the ground. Baka, I told him that stab wound was going to get to him eventually. The pink-haired girl carried on muttering, even as she and the female, genin, moved up to him and picked him up, waving off the 2 ENBU who had shoe-shined down to check on him. Whatever the story actually was, Izumo was sure that by this evening the entirety of Konoha would know about it.